use that. Okay, thank you. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. This is our second interim meeting for the Wyoming Legislature's Joint Committee of Minerals, Business, and Economic Development. We've got a very interesting agenda, but it isn't a heavy agenda because we were graciously hosted by the School of Energy Resources and University of Wyoming. And we want to take some time this afternoon and then tomorrow afternoon to visit some of these wonderful facilities. So my understanding is when we finish this early afternoon, we'll get to go through this SER building. We will do a tour of the new engineering building, which I know the drilling simulator has been moved over there. And then also, I don't know, I've been through it, but the NZ STEM building, we'll try to do a quick walkthrough of that as well. And then hopefully tomorrow, not hopefully, tomorrow we will, and I hope all the legislators will stay and participate in it, go to the High Bay Research Facility and see some of the, quite frankly, groundbreaking, state-of-the-art leading technology that is being put to use, some tremendous resource for some tremendous research for the state of Wyoming. So with today's meeting, let's go ahead and call the roll call, please.
Senator Beitman. Here. Senator Cooper. Here. Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Senator Wasserberger.
Here.
Representative Bear.
Here.
Representative Burkhart.
Here.
Representative Duncan.
Here.
Representative Ayer.
Here.
Representative Gray.
Here.
Representative Heiner.
Here.
Representative Sherwood.
Here.
Representative Western.
Here.
Co-chairman Anderson.
Here.
Co-chairman Greer.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. We have everybody present. Awesome. Okay. Well, our first item for discussion is our industrial siting. This was a motion brought by Representative Heiner at our last meeting to continue on some work that's been going on for several years. I think our motion was to bring back the Senate bill as engrossed, which passed through the House Minerals Committee, but just missed the deadline during our busy session. So I think Mr. Fuller and Representative Heiner, I'll let you guys take the lead on this. We have Representative Larson from Lander, who has an important lunch this afternoon. So he's zooming in. Representative Larson has worked on this for several years as a member of the Joint Appropriations Committee, has a great deal of knowledge and background on this. And then also Jeremiah Ryman with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, fully intended to participate in person, but has an illness right now and will be in remotely. And I don't know if I see him up on that screen yet. But I think to kick it off, Mr. Fuller, could you just give us a little bit of a history of the legislation and then the bill draft committee members, which was in your original materials? We'll go through that. And then I know Representative Heiner and Representative Larson have a proposed amendment that we really would like to work into this that I think they've been working on with Jeremiah as well. So with that, I'll be quiet. Mr. Fuller.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Brian Fuller, LSO, should have 22 LSO 0084 in front of you. This bill draft, Mr. Chairman, at least the recent history, the Joint Appropriations Committee has looked at this issue in the past. There was a bill 2021 Senate File 82 last year that the bill draft in front of you is largely based on and is the engrossed version. And in sum, this bill draft amends requirements that are related to the local impact assistance payments that are made in conjunction with the construction of an industrial facility, as that term is defined in the industrial siting statutes. Mr. Chairman, I can walk through the bill now or proceed as you wish.
Mr. Fuller, why don't you give us just an overview? And then I think we're all familiar with the bill. We'll take our public comment, and then I think what we'll do is have you walk us through the bill, and then end with the proposed amendment. I'm still trying to figure out the smoothest way to do this. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just in summary, the bill does a couple of things in the statutes concerning the sales and use tax, and where the language is that the payments are made and how they're determined. What happens is that for the construction of an industrial facility, the statute requires the Department of Revenue to pay an amount to the county treasurer where the facility will be located, based on an amount that the Industrial Siting Council determines after considering the mitigated and unmitigated impacts that the construction of the industrial facility will have on the counties, cities, and towns determined by the council to be affected by the construction of the industrial facility. The council, the Industrial Siting Council, must review the evidence and determine by a preponderance of the evidence the dollar amount of the unmitigated impacts. And when the council issues an order, they must state the dollar amount and the reasons for reaching that dollar amount of the impact payment. Under current statute, under no circumstances can the impact assistance payment exceed 2.76% of the total estimated material costs of the facility as the Industrial Siting Council determines those costs. That payment is then distributed to affected counties and cities and towns within that county on a ratio that the council determines during a public hearing. The statute also provides that the impact assistance payment is in addition to all other distributions for sales and use tax, but there can be no impact payment for any period that the county isn't imposing that additional penny sales tax. In a brief nutshell, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the bill draft changes the requirements for determining the amount of the impact assistance payment. It would require the Industrial Siting Council to include in its order specific findings of fact detailing the basis for the total dollar amount determination. It would decrease the maximum percentage of the payment from 2.76% to 2.25%. It provides that in determining the distribution ratio of the payments to the county and the cities and towns, the Industrial Siting Council may consider the extent and location of the unmitigated impacts, the populations of the affected cities and towns and counties, and any disproportionate impacts in smaller communities. And then, Mr. Chairman, finally, the final kind of large change is a definition of unmitigated impact as it is used for purposes of these impact assistance payments. It would mean an expense that a county, city, or town incurs directly or indirectly that's attributable to the construction of the industrial facility. It's an expense that's not otherwise mitigated by any other entity. It's an expense for medical, fire, and law enforcement, for roads and public utilities. And those expenses must be supported by an analysis by the county, city, or town of the current excess capacity of those services or infrastructure in those areas. And it excludes expenses for which a county, city, or town has previously received an impact assistance payment unless the county, city, or town can demonstrate that the expenses are either new or are ongoing.
Okay. Thank you. That was a good overview. So Representative Heiner, yeah, why don't you come down front, and then Representative Larson, I'll let you and Representative Heiner, I'll give you the freedom as legislators to kind of just do whatever you got to do to get the information to us.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can.
So if it pleases you, Mr. Chairman, maybe I'll kind of, because this came out of our Joint Appropriations Committee, maybe kind of just add a little bit to what Mr. Fuller pointed out to you. This change in the definition of unmitigated impacts is pretty significant and important. The existing definition for unmitigated impact is in the Department of Environmental Quality rules and was pretty ambiguous. And so when counties and municipalities were coming before the Industrial Siting Commission to seek assistance with this, it was pretty broad in the definition, at least in our opinion. And so that caused us to reflect back, Mr. Chairman, to the history of this whole act being brought. You'll recall that prior to 2015, when an industrial siting came in, or an industrial project came into a community or into a county, the county really had to absorb all of that cost up front, and then they made it up at the end when 18 months later, when sales tax or enhanced sales tax started coming in. And it was really quite a burden on cities and counties. The then chairman of revenue, Mike Madden, came up with a suggestion that says maybe we ought to try and help them on the front end of that. And we passed this version of impact assistance, which, as Mr. Furl pointed out, we provide assistance for mitigation of these impacts in addition to the other sales tax. So what we're doing is we're using the state's portion, not the locals portion of the sales tax, but the state's portion of the sales tax to help the counties and cities mitigate the impacts of these new industries coming into the community, which everybody, and so in essence, we're just kind of filling a gap, because in 18 months, we expect to see increased tax revenue coming into the counties because of the property values, the ad valorem, and other things associated with that. And as this rolled out, what we found is that because of the broad definition of unmitigated impacts and really the unknown on what the costs would be, we've seen significant increases in unmitigated impact costs, and as well, we've seen the same unmitigated impact being declared. For example, you have a wind farm come in, an unmitigated impact is claimed on that one, and the next year another wind farm comes into the area and the same unmitigated impact was claimed again. And we thought that there should be a little more data provided to justify why those funds would be allocated again for the same unmitigated impact, whether it be to a county or city. And so that's what constituted this new language. Then last year, when this come out of the Senate, passed the Senate as passed, and it had a reduction from 2.76 down to 2.25%, came to your committee, and in your committee, you amended it down from 2.25% down to 2%. We got to the end of session, Mr. Chairman, you and I were approached and thought we knew what was going on, and thought that this bill would still be heard. And it wasn't. It was the next bill up had we had a little more time. And so here we are again addressing it. But in the interim, what happened is the county commissioners reached out to Representative Heiner and myself and says, we, and what we've heard from them is the clarification on why and justification on some of this stuff is important and is warranted. But then what they come back with was, why don't we maybe, instead of just reducing that down to from 2.76 to another percentage, whether it be 2.25 or 2%, but why don't we do a tiered system? And you'll see is an amendment that comes into that, and I think that it makes really good sense that from 0 to $500 million is 1%, and probably be the higher percentage. From 500 million to $1 billion, would be another percentage, and then anything over $1 billion would be another percentage. And we didn't plug those numbers in on the amendment, and thought it was worthy of this committee's discussion to kind of reflect and look and see what that appropriate number may be. The county commissioners as well as LSO in their studies have provided a lot of documentation showing what various percentages, meaning from 2.76 down to 2.2% to 1.75%, and how that impacts those various tiers. The other thing that we think would be important is to have the communities and the counties report back to the Industrial Siting Commission starting a year after they received their funds, to report on how those funds were used, to verify that they were used for the unmitigated impacts that they applied for, and that would continue on an annual basis until those funds were expended. And then the Industrial Siting Commission would make that report available to your committee, Mr. Chairman, and to the Joint Appropriations Committee. So I think if you accept the amendment that Representative Heiner may go into more detail on, we would need to have a further conversation either today or before your next meeting on what those numbers should be in that tiered system. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd maybe let Representative Heiner, who's been doing a lot of work on this on the interim, clean up my mess.
Okay, before we go to Representative Heiner, Representative Duncan had a question.
Sure.
One that looks like the guy speaking here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's difficult this morning. Thank you, Representative Larson, and and Representative Heiner. Can you give me an example? As I read through all of this and the information and such, I'm struggling with exactly what kind of impacts they're talking about. I get the infrastructure and extra roads and things, but what kind of what are the payments going towards, as just an overall example of a few, if you could?
You know what, that Representative Heiner is reaching for his microphone, so we'll let him, and he lives in this world. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Duncan, the intent of this law, this statute, was to address unmitigated impacts. And the key word is unmitigated. What the LSO has done for us during this last couple of months, they have evaluated other states and how they address this kind of an impact. And we're the only state in the union where the state actually pays for mitigation in this fashion. Most of the time, the industry that comes in and creates an impact pays for that impact. For example, as I envision this, if a large windmill farm comes into the area and they need to build a road or upgrade a county road to provide access, the industry would pay for upgrading that road. And then the unmitigated impacts would be overtime for first responders, overtime for the snowplow operators to keep that road open, things like that are not something that's easily quantified. So during the past few years, a lot of those impacts have been put upon the state rather than industry, and the state is paying out a lot of money for impacts for these large projects.
So before we move to Representative Heiner's comments, Representative Larson is a long-serving member of the Appropriations Committee. You should know the answer to this question. So as the bill was presented last year, as it passed the Senate, what was the anticipated savings? And it's savings right to the general fund, correct?
It is savings to the general fund, Mr. Chairman, because that is coming. If they funded that at the full 2.76%, that would leave about of the division on sales tax, that would leave the state getting about 1% of their share of the sales tax. And so I don't know what the exact savings were anticipated based on what has been allocated since that bill was passed, Mr. Chairman, but it was significant. And I would also point out that these projects weren't always funded at the full 2.76%. They varied between that. But if I may, Mr. Chairman, so I flunked the test. I can't give you that exact amount. But if you'll allow me to also address kind of what Representative Duncan's question was, is so the way that the counties could, or in cities, we use counties, and but it means, of course, both, is they may say we're going to have an unmitigated impact on we need to and think that we need an additional fire truck, or maybe we need over the course of the construction, because this is during the construction, the unmitigated impacts during the construction. And so we anticipate that we will have need more sheriff's patrols out, and that's going to warrant an additional sheriff's vehicle, or it may be that it's going to cover a broader section of our county, and so we need additional radios to help with that. And so that would be the application, but there's nothing there that says once they receive the money that they have to actually use it for those purposes. And that's been a little bit of the struggle is if the intent was to hire firemen, then we would expect to see that firemen were hired, and oftentimes we're not seeing that. And so we think putting these sideboards on there just kind of helps the legislature understand that indeed these unmitigated impacts, in which we don't argue that there are some, that those funds then are being used to address those unmitigated impacts as they were identified by the county or the municipality.
Okay, well, we'll keep moving. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the explanation of kind of what the motivation of the legislation is. And we have for years heard concerns regarding industrial siting, as well as the benefits of it, which I think you understand certainly better than I do. The concern I have is I'm not sure this legislation and really focusing on changing the number is the key to making the process more efficient and simultaneously addressing the fact that we're paying for unmitigated expense, or excuse me, mitigatable, I guess, expenses, as opposed to redefining the unmitigated. The concern I have, and so I'm just interested in hearing through the narrative where I'm wrong about this, is one of the criticisms we've heard about the industrial siting process is that the original intent was good. It was let's find a way to ensure that these communities have the money when they need it to address the development through these large projects. But it's turned into an incredibly bureaucratic, cumbersome, litigious process that takes an epic number of hearings, so much time and so much expense that it's daunting for these larger projects, which I don't think was the intent. This doesn't seem to address any of that. And honestly, I don't know why changing the number, whether we have a threshold or a cut in through the amendment or anything else, really addresses that and gets us closer to the original objective either. The memo I really appreciated, which provides that other states do it very dramatically difficult, and it just looks like it's directly to the point. You're going to have upfront costs. You're not going to have the money to pay for that because your sales tax is coming later. How do we provide for an opportunity to get that? So I guess as we walk through this more and hear more explanation, that's a general inquiry to the proponents to explain how we're accomplishing the objectives that are being set out. I see the objective and I see the bill, and I don't see how the latter accomplishes the former. Thank you.
So Representative Heiner or Larson, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like, if I may, I'd like to go back to Senator Office and ask a question, because I may have missed something there. He talked about this process being onerous and litigious on it, and I'm trying to figure. I missed, who is it litigious to? Is it to the proponent of the project, or is it litigious to the county and the city who was trying to get the impact assistance?
Go ahead, Senator Brecan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative. My recollection is that you end up with highly contested under some circumstances, industrial siting hearings where all of the parties are involved and you have challenges to the numbers, and it ends up being a rather arduous process. And I'm not saying it's always that way, but we've certainly seen circumstances where it has been that way. And I don't think that was the original intent. And as we add more burdens of evidence, it seems like it just opens it up for more of that fine detail noodling ahead of time, as opposed to actually moving forward and getting the projects going, assuming that there aren't other barriers to the projects. I hope that clarifies. Thank you.
It did, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss. Thank you. And so, Mr. Chairman, if I may, a little bit as we start to work through this, I would just say that I think the approach of this bill should, the concern that you have, if you're a proponent, if you're the person that's putting in the project, is what are going to be my costs for mitigated impacts. And so you work through that with the Industrial Siting Commission. Then you come back and you've got the cities and the municipalities saying, yes, you've addressed these mitigated impacts, so you're gonna have to put in a new road, you're gonna have to address these things that we know the impacts are going to be, a water system, whatever's determined that are easily identifiable. But then the municipalities and the counties coming back and say, but as well, we have these unmitigated impacts, because now during the construction of this, we're going to have 300 extra people here, and we have the potential to have an impact on the hospital. We have a potential impact on our sewer system, which is already maxed out. We have a potential. And so this really shifts away from the proponent of the project back to the Industrial Siting Commission awarding unmitigated impacts back to these municipalities in counties. And it has nothing to do with the fees that will be or the cost of the project. This is funded by the state. And so this is not something that would really be argued by the proponent of the project is putting it in, because they're not going to have any obligation in paying any of these unmitigated impacts that we're talking about. And so I think we bifurcate this process in this, and we said, okay, moving forward, you've got your permit, here's your mitigated impacts moving forward. And now the Industrial Siting Commission has been tasked with identifying what the unmitigated impacts are and how and the requests that are made, to which of those requests that are made should be funded. And I think that we have given them up to this bill, I think the direction we've given the Industrial Siting Commission has been light. We made the assumption that there would be perhaps an easier path in making these determinations than there was. But as we sit back and we've seen over those first few years that okay, here's the unmitigated impact request. We allow, even though it may not be the 2.76, it may be a percentage of what that is for these unmitigated impacts, but then we see the funds aren't being used to address those particular impacts the application was made for. Well, if they didn't, if they weren't used to address those, then why were they claimed to be unmitigated? And so we're trying to clean up and validate that. And the basis for the Appropriations Committee is we're saying there are state general fund revenues there that are being sidetracked that impact the rest of the state for perhaps providing impact resources that may or may not be warranted. And so we've got to have a clearer picture of what those are, and that's what this bill attempts to do. And then if some of these unmitigated impacts aren't warranted, then maybe the percentage of what we're reimbursing, the 2.76, 2.25, could be reduced some. And so in we certainly want to help the counties and cities out, but we also need to be cognizant of the impact that it has on our general fund dollars as well.
Follow up, Senator?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative, I appreciate that explanation. And there's a couple of points that I wanted to latch on into there. First of all, the idea of ensuring that the mitigation funds are used for the purposes provided makes perfect sense. I think that's a good addition. But getting back to your point about bifurcating the process, and my apologies for not being familiar with exactly how this plays out now and whether it would change, but you've got the industrial siting permit process. Is the process already issued? Excuse me, is the permit already issued? And then these details are worked out as a separate bifurcated process so that the amounts that the state is going to provide for mitigation assistance is an after process that the project owner doesn't have to participate in now? Is that what you just suggested, or are you suggesting that that is how this is, that this would change it in that way? And my apologies for not knowing that nuance.
Why don't we do this, Senator? Mr. Esch is here, scheduled to testify.
Awesome. Wait for that.
Why don't we ask Mr. Esch that particular question on that process?
That sounds great.
And
Thank
we'll
you, Mr.
try to
Chairman.
move things along here.
And I'm just trying to grind it to a halt as I do.
Between you and Representative Larson, you're doing a wonderful job.
We can talk all day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll wait for Mr. Esch. Agenda item 1.
Okay. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, and committee members. To give you a little more color about the Industrial Siting Act, it's been in statute since 1974, so it's almost 50 years that this has been in place. And it was originally intended to preserve or protect the natural environment and quality of life, not to enhance or build upon that, but to preserve. So a facility that is their constructed cost is greater than $230 million has to get an industrial siting permit or a waiver. Or a solar farm that is over 100 acres or 30 megawatts, or a wind energy project with 20 or more towers, or any commercial waste incineration or radioactive waste management has to have an industrial siting permit. So the Industrial Siting Council is made up of 7 non-elected individuals that are able to allocate general fund money from the state. These are non-elected. They don't answer to citizens. They don't answer to anyone but the governor. And so they have been able to allocate the state's portion of sales tax for these impacts. So the 2.76 comes from the state share is 4% of sales tax and then 69% of that. And that's the 2.76. So the counties and municipalities get their portion of the sales tax, but the state has put their portion of all the sales tax from that project on the table and left it up to these 7 non-elected individuals to allocate to mitigate these impacts. And it's getting to be quite huge. During 2018, they allocated $34.8 million from the general fund. In 2019, they allocated $33.9 million from our general fund. Now, last year, even with the pandemic and most things shut down, they allocated almost $10 million from our general fund. So it's getting to be quite huge. And what we're trying to do is not only, we're focusing on this impact percentage, but the accountability is a real issue here. We are giving the money to the cities and municipalities and counties with no reporting mechanism whatsoever. We don't know how it's spent once it's awarded. And so part of this is to try to create a reporting mechanism so that we ensure that that money is being spent as we vision it being spent, as allocated. We want to improve the what is actually unmitigated. We want to make that more clear. Unmitigated impact versus impacts that can be mitigated. The memo that came out from the LSA was quite eye-opening for me, that we are the only state that do it in this fashion. And industry is not being asked to carry the burden of some of these impacts that is being created when they come into a vicinity. And that may need to be changed in the future as well, to put more of the burden on industry. And I understand the comment from Senator Rothus. This is something that we may look at more in the future. So Senate, the reason I brought this back to this committee is because it has broad support from both chambers. Senate File 82 passed the Senate last session 27-3. It came to the House Minerals Committee and it passed 8-1. The year prior, House Bill 237 passed the House and it passed 50-7. So it has broad support. We just need to bring it together again, because even though this is a budget year, it has potential to impact our revenue as a state, where we're giving out tens of millions of dollars every year with lack of oversight, adequate oversight. Maybe we need to tighten it up a little bit. So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, and members of the committee, there's three things that I would like to focus on here. Number one is to clarify what is an unmitigated impact, so that we put a focus on unmitigated impacts and try to put more of the burden upon industry for impacts that can be mitigated. In my profession, I've worked with other states, and as a business, we bought the fire trucks when we went into an industry, and we built a chemical plant that they didn't have a foam truck. They just had water trucks. We bought them the foam truck. It wasn't the state that did that. The other thing is to improve accountability. As Representative Larson mentioned, there's sometimes that the local government is asking for help with some impacts, and they have multiple projects, and they ask for the same thing from all different projects. And we don't know that money is actually being spent, where it's being spent. So we're proposing that they provide annual reports to the ISC, and then they give give that oversight to us on an annual basis to ensure that money is being spent appropriately. And the third is to tighten up the approach to awarding the money a little bit, give a little more oversight to these non-elected officials, such that they have a little bit more scrutiny as they are looking at these things. And to do that, we're trying to bring down those awards a little bit, the ability to allocate the dollars of the state. So I'm a numbers guy. I looked at numbers, and during the past 3 years, we proposed these 3 tiers, up to 500 million, 500 to $1 billion, and anything over $1 billion dollars. So over the past 3 years, there were 15 projects, and 13 of the projects fell within that first tier. So 85% were within that first tier. And if you take the average amount that was allocated for mitigating impacts, they allocated about 2%. So if we squeeze that 2.76 down to 2%, the effect would be almost zero, because that's what they're basically allocating right now. The 2 projects that were over $500 million, they were less than $1 billion, and the ISC awarded 1.1% of the maximum allowable. So I've given you a little table in your packet of different percentages, so you can scrutinize that a little bit closer. But what that final percentage, I think the tiered approach is an excellent idea that came from the County Commissioners Association. And maybe we want to put an upward ceiling on that as well. The little table I gave you had a ceiling of $20 million per project. Maybe that's a good number. Maybe it's not. This committee, I ask you to look at that and let's come up with a solution that works for everyone.
Okay, so Representative Hunter, so the bill draft that we have before us just moves the maximum amount awarded. Okay, so then the amendment that was drafted, which was it should have been on everybody's desk now, is something that you've been working with the County Commissioners Association, Representative Larson. Do you just why don't you just I'm familiar with the tier system. Why don't you just give us a quick overview of what you're looking at with that?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The tiered approach was originally proposed by our County Commissioners Association, and they originally proposed a 5-tier approach, which was a little bit cumbersome. But Representative Larson and myself talked about this and thought maybe a 3-tiered approach is a good idea, because these projects are getting very expensive, a lot more than what was originally envisioned 50 years ago. And as you get into larger projects, we wanted to be able to, as we've seen in the past 3 years, the larger projects don't need that higher percentage because of the dollar amount. So we arbitrarily came up with anything under 500 million, and then the middle category 500 to $1 billion, and then the higher anything over $1 billion. So this would just put some sideboards on the Industrial Siting Commission. And the numbers we have left blank at this point, hoping that this committee can come up with the appropriate number to plug in there, and then we will go forward with the bill.
Okay. Any questions for Representative Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that explanation on the First Amendment. And I will say I like option D because it's the least expensive. But on the Second Amendment, this report, what's the remedy? I mean, if they report that they're using these dollars on something wacky, I mean, there's no way to claw it back other than saying, well, in the future, it's going to be taken out on other entities. And then, what's the auditing authority or the authority to actually determine that these reports are accurate? So there's 2 questions. I mean, where is the ability to claw back the funds or the punishment? Because I think that's important. And 2, like, how do we determine that these are accurate numbers? Does the Industrial Siting Commission have the ability to go through ledgers or so that's the 2 questions. Thank you.
Yep. Good, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Gray. Appreciate the comment and the question, because Representative Larson and I discussed this at length because we had the same concerns. How do you enforce that, and what kind of penalty do you impose? So we're open to suggestions. We don't have a silver bullet there. We're hoping just the reporting mechanism tightens it up. And if we find that this is actually happening, maybe we could withhold funds, because these are monthly distributions. It doesn't just all land on their plate all at once. So for the course of the project construction, which may be 2 years or 3 years, they're monthly distributions. So if we find that they're not going there, then the Industrial Siting Council or this committee, as we receive those reports, we may be able to act upon that.
Okay. Any other questions for Representative Hunter? Yep. Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss asked if this could make it more efficient or easier to operate and those kind of things. I think it's to the contrary. I think it's going to be more difficult for the Industrial Siting Council and the cities and towns to operate because of what we're setting up. They're going to have to prove their unmitigated expenses and those kind of things. The ones that I've seen that have been a problem for the ISC is where it's 2 counties involved. I'm assuming that continues the same, and the 2 counties still have to prove that they have expenses and prove it to the ISC satisfaction. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, I believe that is still going to be an issue that the counties will have to work out and come to some collaboration, how they will resolve those impacts between the counties. And that's been a problem with the Industrial Siting Commission in the past, is, how to allocate those monies. And a lot of times they leave it up to the counties to decide amongst themselves. So yes, it doesn't resolve that, but it does put more emphasis on smaller communities. The wording of this amendment allows the Industrial Siting Commission to put more money to get away from population-based and more towards actual impacts, because smaller communities sometimes have the larger impacts as their utility systems do not have the fat in them per se to be able to handle a influx of people.
Yep, go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at this tiered support and following up on Chairman Anderson's question, if you option C, for example, 2% down to 1.5%, it sounds like this is very similar to what has happened. So after detailed scrutiny, tens of hours of work, hundreds of hours of work, thousands, who knows how many human hours go into it, you pretty much get the same answer. Was there any discussion in contemplating this legislation of just fixing the number and saying, for example, you get 2%, 1.75%, 1.5%, you can bill up to that effectively, and the unmitigated expenses would be billed effectively to industrial siting if they qualify, or maybe on a pre-approval, something like that. So that gets both the reporting side of it and makes it easier as opposed to more challenging to go with a fixed number. Was there any discussion of just jumping to the answer?
Senator or Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, we didn't have any discussion of that sort whereby we got direct billed from the county or the municipality. I think that would put a lot of oversight on the Industrial Siting Commission, but I don't believe they're staffed for that at this point. The Industrial Siting Commission doesn't have that many employees per se. They do have the 7 commissioners that are actually just assigned for the hearings and oversight. But I think that would put a lot of burden upon the Industrial Siting Commission to manage that. And we'd have to have some very stringent rules at that point. We did talk about oversight from this committee to have the ultimate approval, similar to what we do with our omnibus water bills, so that the Industrial Siting Commission made recommendations, but couldn't actually allocate the money until approved by the legislature, because that constitutionally, that is our responsibility to appropriate funds of the state. And we've delegated that to these 7 non-elected individuals, and they're appropriating tens of millions of dollars every year from our general fund.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about just the idea, though, of fixing the number instead of going through the whole process of trying to figure out that it is in fact 1.97%? That's the right answer. Just skipping to the end and saying 2%. It's going to be 2% if it's a project up to 10 million. It's going to be 1.75% for the next phase, the 500 to $1 billion. And it's going to be 1.5%. Those are arbitrary numbers, right? Whatever we decided upon. So instead of going through the review process where you require the detailed scrutiny that comes up with the same number each time, trying to make this less bureaucratic and challenging and give a fixed number. Was that something that was considered? I see also that Representative Larson has an interest in that.
Yeah, Representative Larson, go ahead.
I'm trying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that I completely understand what Senator Rothfuss is proposing and would like that clarified a little bit for me. So are we saying on a 3-tiered system that 0, and again, arbitrary numbers, so 0 to 500 million would be 2%. And so that would be what would be available to counties irregardless is 2. And then the other 2 would be a similar thing. And then that would be distributed to the counties without, and they wouldn't have to make an application. We just say, here's the 2% and go and do well.
Mr. Chairman, following up on that, yes, but then, Mr. Chairman, you would then have a submission of actuals, so to speak. So it gets to the idea that there was an interest of ensuring that they're spent in an appropriate way. We do that in the education space all the time, where you get a 100% reimbursement up against some amount of money that you have available. But there's effectively a checkbox that, yes, this was a an approvable expense so that, you know, you're not just building something as there was a clear interest in that's outside the scope of the intent. So if it qualified as an unmitigated expense, that would be an okay. Industrial siting would maybe make that determination. Seems like that's more scrutiny, getting to Representative Gray's interest, where you actually have direct scrutiny and a process that wouldn't be easily circumvented, would keep things in line, but would be a dramatic simplification as far as I can tell, and still achieve your interests. So I hope that clarifies.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, so thank you, Senator Office, for that. But I think that I think that's really kind of what we're saying with the amendment, that, for example, in the first tier, just for conversation's sake, we say that it's 2%. And the Industrial Siting Commission can allow up to 2% for unmitigated impacts. And the counties, the only difference would be is that the counties have to apply on the front end so that we don't have to claw back something on the back end and say, this is what we want to use these monies for. And here's our data that justifies these unmitigated impacts. And they can allocate up to 2%. And I think that that's basically saying the same thing you are, except for you do the reporting on the back end.
Mr. Chairman, one quick follow-up.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify the difference, though, that process that was described, Representative Larson, by you in one sentence, is a long, challenging, difficult, human-intensive process, where if the number always comes to 2, I don't know why we need to do the calculation.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, yeah, let's just wrap up, because you guys are going down 2 different paths and they're not gonna converge. So go ahead, Representative Larson.
And the point being is it doesn't have to be 2%. It can be up to 2%.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll keep moving on. I understand the point. The fact of the matter is that part of the overall planning and thinking about the impacts goes into this thinking about it in advance. And then I also think, Senator Rothfuss, there would have to be a concern by the counties of, we're not going to spend this money for this impact if we have a chance of it being clawed back. And so that's what we're trying to balance here a little bit. So I think with that, why don't, Mr. Riemann, if you are available, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the County Commissioners Association. If it pleases you, I believe we've got Commissioner Doc Wendling in the room, and I'd like to be able to provide him a chance to make a couple comments before I get into mine.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner. Come on up. It's fine. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Oh, there we go. Thank you. New technology. With industrial siting hearings in the future, we hope to upgrade to these. But anyhow, first off, good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members, as well as local Representative Heiner. Thank you very much. I've listened, and there's some Jeremiah questions in there that I'm going to leave for Jeremiah and that's worked hard on it. But I think there's a couple of things I'd like to share with us is since in 2019, the commission wrote a letter to the siting administrators of support in defining unmitigated circumstances, which I fully believe is the question here today. So without a doubt, we look forward through the WCCA, as well as through this committee, as well as other local representatives, to help determine that. A few talking points regarding local impact assistance payments. Industrial siting program is, we all know, administered by the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, assesses and addresses the socioeconomic and environmental impact of the major industry developments throughout Sweetwater County. I just remembered I didn't introduce myself, and it's Commissioner Doc Wendling from Sweetwater County. And I apologize for that. I just, when I looked down, I realized
I knew who you were,
I
but
did.
I appreciate
But
you introducing
as I
yourself.
looked through everybody else, I didn't know if everyone else did as well. As we know, impact payments, which we've been talking about, ensure counties and municipalities ensure that we have resources and that type of thing. Without this assistance, local services such as law enforcement, public works, which these includes water and sewer, human services, and transportation systems would be neglected. So impact assistance is very important, which all of us know. Since 2005, 13 counties have received impact assistance payments throughout the state of Wyoming. And those were Albany, Campbell, Carbon, Converse, Crook, Johnson, Laramie, Lincoln, Madrona, Sheridan, Sweetwater, Uena, and Weston. In addition, an additional 7 counties face the potential of wind or solar development. The Industrial Siting Council has proven capable stewards. I've heard a lot of conversation as the Industrial Siting Council, and I've been fortunate to represent Sweetwater County before the last 3, and they were the Trans West, the Gateway South, and Gateway West. And I will say that I've walked away scratching my head thinking, how come they're so stingy with state dollars? So I do want to give you notice that they have done a very good job. But I will not get into the dialogue as to whether or not how much oversight you as legislators want with that organization. But anyhow, since 2018, the council has awarded 62% of the maximum allowable award, which is approximately 48 million less than local governments were able to receive. Further, the council is pursuing rulemaking, including developing a definition for unmitigated impacts. The state also benefits, in addition to addressing the state priorities at the local level. The state receives other financial benefits for industrial development, i.e. sales and use tax, property tax, etc. To highlight this, in the last 36 months, development proposals exceed $4.5 billion in project and material costs. Going through to some of the conversation that I've heard, Sweetwater County has worked with Carbon County in all 3 of the transmission impacts council hearings, and have had worked very closely with their leadership and figuring out a way to come forward before the impact, before the board was meeting, and have things laid out to make things work for both counties. Also, Sweetwater County has worked diligently with Lincoln County for the ExxonMobil Chute Creek expansion. Of those ones I've just mentioned, the transmission west is moving forward and that type of thing, but postponed has been the Gateway South, Gateway West, and the ExxonMobil Chute Creek. We do presently, let me just check my note quick, we do have a 2012 industrial site and impact project that is still in process, and that's the Genesis Alkali Granger expansion for Trona, and that's still taking place, but that follows under the old rules. Under our new rules, though, I am very pleased to say that in Sweetwater County, as the Industrial Siting Board lays out what the allowed expenditures are, whether they're mitigated or unmitigated, we do keep track of those very carefully and know where the dollars are, as where they're being spent as those payments come in monthly. A real good example is our ambulance company wanted a new ambulance, and it was approved by the Industrial Siting Council, and that was through the Trans West. First of all, as those payments came in, there was not enough money to purchase that new ambulance. And we made certain that before any investigation or anything went out with regard to purchase that ambulance, that money was there. Then also from the county's aspect of it regarding that ambulance or anything else, we made sure that ambulance was a county-owned piece of equipment. In other words, the Sweetwater Medics, which is a private company that we provide dollars for in operating ambulance service for the Sweetwater County. When they requested that ambulance, we made sure that ambulance is in our inventory, and we'll make sure that if they go out of business or if they're bought out, that ambulance will come back in. So I feel very confident that we do have some good oversight in Sweetwater County. I do know that, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, we know that our small towns and small communities without impact fees and that type of thing have a very difficult time in working towards any impact that would have. The town of Granger, where the Genesis Alkali expansion's taking place, is a small town of 100, but yet we know that there's a great amount of impact to that community. Now, again, too, that's previous industrial siting, but we also know that money comes in a different way. We have several possible industrial sightings coming up to the tune of Genesis Alkali's, not Genesis Alkali, Jenner's new expansion in the southwest part of our county, which is the Solution Mining, which is now estimated at over a $2 billion project for Solution Mining. So with that, if I can answer any questions, I would be happy to.
You bet. Thank you,
Thank
Commissioner.
you.
Representative Burkhart has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple. So, Commissioner, why was a new ambulance needed?
The new ambulance, because of the extra runs and distances that it was going to be expected to make, and the fleet being an older fleet, they felt that new ambulance was necessary and was requested through the council, and the council approved it.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So it was the industrial siting payments out of the Transwest power line. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. So
Hold on. Let's go ahead and work through the chair.
I'm sorry,
we're not
Mr.
in a court of
Chairman.
law here. Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr.
I'm
Chairman.
sorry,
I
I'm sorry,
apologize.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Go ahead, Representative Burkhart.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Commissioner, how many runs did that new ambulance make on that power line project?
I couldn't tell you that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Any other questions for the commissioner? Okay, Mr. Reman, go ahead.
All right, thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to make sure you heard from Commissioner directly. I'll try and just add some additional color to his comments. First off, in terms of accountability, that's certainly something that we've been adamant about for some time. And as the commissioner referenced, and as I provided the committee back in 2019, we did ask for the Industrial Siting Council to undertake a rulemaking process in order to adopt a definition for unmitigated impacts. And secondarily, we requested that they adopt a reporting requirement because we had heard concerns, and frankly, we were concerned to ensure that there were no inappropriate uses of the funds and that they were in fact used as they had been requested. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I did also provide you, and I had hoped we would have Commissioner John Johnson from Carbon County to explain it a little bit more, but I provided you their accounting for the various industrial siting projects that they have undertaken and been approved funding. So you can see their specific accounting of the funding. We're not ashamed to provide that information. And if anybody ever wanted to request it, we would be happy to provide that from any of the counties. It is an important a part of the equation that we are accountable to what we say we are going to use those funds for. The commissioner mentioned the counties that have received impact assistance payments, and he also referenced that there are an additional 7 counties that face potential of development in their region, and that's what I provided in terms of the solar and wind maps, which is to demonstrate that this isn't an issue that just revolves around those 13 that have received funding to date. There are going to be projects in other places and communities that have not had the fortune to be able to access the industrial siting program. And it's important that we have available resources for them if those projects come. In fact, we have a project proposed in Fremont County, a solar project, and Fremont County has not benefited from the program, and any changes to the program will have a significant impact on their ability to address those unmitigated impacts. I did want to make note that there are 2 counties currently that are not eligible to receive impact assistance payments. Those are Sublette and Park County. They're ineligible because they do not currently impose a 1% general purpose tax, which is a limitation that exists in the law. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that. Commissioner did reference that since 2018, the commission or the council has awarded on average 62% of the maximum eligible award. I want to make a couple of comments around that. First off, that's an average. And just to give you some sense, there's been some talk about 2%, it has been their cap. The reality is that 8 of the last 13 projects that have been permitted have received impact assistance payments or awards greater than 2%. And in fact, taking that a bit further, 4 of the last 5 projects have, in the council's judgment, demanded resources in excess of the 2%. So the numbers do matter. And I think it's important that the council have the ability, when it's appropriate, to go above that 2% threshold that's been referenced. And in one case, they went all the way to the 2.76%. It is important in terms of the benefits that can be accrued here. And I think the counties feel a responsibility to the state in this system. Another reason I had hoped you might be able to hear from Commissioner John Johnson is to hear him share his frustration with the Department of Revenue's actual oversight to ensure that the companies are in fact registered with the state of Wyoming and paying taxes. In one instance, the county sent its sheriff and treasurer out to a development project, and in their investigation, they ultimately ensured that $50,000 in workers' compensation monies were captured to the state. They ensured that $60,000 in sales and use tax was collected on a crane, which had not happened. And they found 10 subcontractors that had not registered with the state, which meant that you had sales and use tax not being collected and submitted. In fact, one of those ended up skipping the state after the sheriff and the treasurer visited. So we do feel a responsibility in this, just as much as we obtain resources. We feel a responsibility to ensure that the state is getting its return on these projects. There's been reference to the amendment that's been brought forward. We did propose a tiered system. We do continue to support a tiered system. I did not come here today to suggest what those numbers should be. I want to continue to work with Representative Larson, Representative Heiner, and the committee on that. We had originally suggested that the max award should be available for smaller dollar projects. Those are the projects that are harder to mitigate for local governments, but as they get larger, it's a little bit easier because there are additional resources available. But we are interested in continuing to work with you. Senator Rothfuss, you did reference to some of that litigious confrontational approach that has happened in the past. A lot of frustration on occasion from local governments when the Industrial Siting Council would, what at least appears outwardly to be arbitrarily, would just suggest that they're going to award 50% of all the requests. That's really difficult for local governments to figure out how to buy half of an ambulance or a fire truck or half of a communications tower. And so that's the reason that I brought forward the additional amendment that I submitted, which is that the Industrial Siting Council should be accountable back to the local governments in understanding what was the justification for the denial that they may have received. And that ultimately will ensure that local governments are better informed as they make their requests. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would say we are interested in continuing to work with all of you on this. We will do that in good faith, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Raymond? Okay, we'll keep moving. Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
Sincere apologies to you and the committee for any protocols that were violated during my testimony. As chairman, I get it for the commission, but when you get before you guys, it's a little tougher job. So, but I apologize.
Oh, no, you're most of the people sitting in the audience can tell you if I thought you're out of line, I would have told you. You're
Thank
fine.
you.
Don't worry
Appreciate
about it. Okay. We'll keep going down the agenda, which has now been destroyed, but it's all right. So Justin Schilling. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Justin Schilling with the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning on the industrial siting proposition that you have in front of you. Obviously, this is a bill that we talked about quite a bit last session in multiple committee meetings, as well as leading up to the session, and working with Jeremiah Ryman and the WCCA kind of offline in stating the municipality's position in this particular discussion. Senator Rothfuss, I think, hits it on the head for our membership and the discussions that we've had internally. I think we're willing to continue this discussion that we're having now about trying to twist the knobs to get the bathwater a little more right in your eyes as far as what these awards have been. But I think the discussion needs to be had and start to be had about how this process, and as Representative Hyder had mentioned, perhaps there's a better way forward where the state isn't footing the bill for these unmitigated impacts, as opposed to the industry being responsible for those. I think the intent and the generosity of the state when this act was originally passed is pretty evident. They were looking to help communities like Gillette, where they were exploding with industry and did not have the capacity to keep up. But I think with this last year, especially as a good example where the state was in a position where the state couldn't be generous or was perhaps hurting more than usual. And then all of a sudden there's a $30,000 hit to the general fund for industrial siting. That's a little uncomfortable, and it begs the questions that you're asking now. But so I think from the municipality standpoint, we're very open to working and continue on in this process, discussing the numbers in the amendment. But I do think that our membership has an appetite to begin talking with the legislature about maybe restructuring the way we do industrial siting, take this off the state's plate and make it more of an interaction between the local communities and the industry.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Schilling? Okay. I appreciate your comments. Something that comes to mind as I've listened so far this morning. So we talk about incentives for industry, and we'll roll into economic development tomorrow. Here we are dealing with a cost that actually could be identified if framed the correct way as a development benefit versus, like a tax credit, which is always very popular in other states for encouraging development. And then here we just do it automatically. So it was good for us to get together, talk, think, see what might be better. So appreciate your comments.
You bet. I appreciate it, sir.
Okay. Mr. Ash, I think we've got, you're up next. I know you have at least one question to answer, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Luke Esch. I'm the Deputy Director and the Administrator of the Industrial Siding Division. I don't have anything prepared, but I did want to just address a few things. First, the industrial siding process is important to a lot of communities due to the ability to really see the true impacts that the project may have on a community. And as well as it provides them, the council has an opportunity to require conditions in the permit to mitigate certain impacts that aren't addressed elsewhere. For example, we recently had a hearing where there were some neighboring landowners that were concerned about their groundwater wells being impacted. The council put a condition in the permit to require baseline monitoring before they could begin construction to make sure that if construction modified it, that was taken care of and they'd have to address those things. And there's been other situations where view shed is required to be modified by the planting of vegetation if things become an issue. So it does provide a very important process and opportunity for comment for neighboring landowners as well as members of the community. One thing that I did hear regarding the original act is the original act actually did have industry paying for the mitigation aspect of it, but that was changed due to it being viewed as very unfriendly towards business. And so they did modify that early on in the process. To the question at hand, the bifurcation of the process, it's kind of evolved over time. It used to be that the whole hearing would take place all at once where you discuss whether the applicant satisfied the statutory conditions to receive the permit, and then you would get a distribution of the impact assistance that's kind of changed to a more, it's bifurcated process. So it's all done in one hearing because it's one written decision from the council, but the first part of the hearing is strictly whether the applicant met the conditions of the statute to receive a permit. The council takes a vote on that. Next is the part where the communities come in and they start talking about impact assistance payments and what their impacts are. The council has the opportunity to ask questions of those community members, try to get justification for certain requests. So it is bifurcated, but it's all still one decision. So they have to wait till the final decision is made in the written order to have the incorporation of the impact assistance payments into the permit itself. To Senator Rothfuss's question about, well, why not pick a number and just set it at 2%? I think that asks a lot of the council because with a project, you have multiple communities all coming in and requesting part of that 2%. So if the council doesn't make a determination on who gets what of that 2%, then it's just a set amount of money that goes out to one county, two counties. So it would be very difficult to make a determination on how that would be split amongst multiple communities. And with that, I would ask one question about the amendment and the impacts it may have on the division. Is it seems to say that the annual report would be provided to the council. The division acts as basically the administrative arms of the council, so we would receive the annual reports. There's a question of whether there would be follow-up. The expectation would be the division would be following up with those communities on that, as well as whether this would be retroactive to existing active permits. And with that, I will just pause for questions.
Okay. Representative Duncan has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple things, a question I have. One is when you made the statement about the previous act, the original act, the industry paid all of it. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because my question is, doesn't industry basically pay all of it now, but we're just giving it back? So I'm confused on the difference.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, as I understand it, whenever it first passed, there was itemized requests that came out from these communities, and they were presented to the project proponent for the project proponent to pay personally, in addition to what they would be paying for in the purchase of the equipment for the project. As it is now, the project proponent buys the materials which come to the state when the state receives the sales tax on that, and the impact assistance payment is taken from that sales and use taxes.
Follow
Quick follow-up.
Okay.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, and my follow-up is, when you go in and you look at these different projects and people come in and say they want, for the example that we had today was the ambulance, do you take into consideration a wish list versus the actual necessity for things and the capacity for communities to be able to receive grants instead of just going out with a blank check?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, so each community in the industrial siting hearing, they submit their exhibits like it is similar. It's a contested case hearing. Their exhibits often contain a general request for, let's use a ambulance for this case. And then you sometimes include a estimate for what that ambulance may cost. And the community is then expected to appear before the Industrial Siting Council during the hearing to provide testimony to support that justification. There's not often, the application often contains a discussion of what the impact of that project will be on health services, ambulance, police, all that. That's contained in the rather extensive socioeconomic analysis for any project. So oftentimes you have an applicant, their application states that the impact of this project will be 0.4 paramedics or 0.5 police officers. So the communities say, well, the application says we need a half of a police officer. You can't really provide a half police officer. So that's when they provide their justification saying, we would like to have enough funds to support a full-time police officer. Or in the ambulance case, well, you can't have a half an ambulance. We need to provide enough funds for a replacement ambulance.
Representative Western. No.
You get a green light down there.
How about now? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ash, just to make sure I'm understanding process here, there's this big discussion about mitigated versus unmitigated. The whole unmitigated impact process and identifying them, defining them, calculating them, paying for them, all that process happens after the project has been approved and constructed and the previously mitigated impacts have been calculated and already paid for, correct? That whole process, or is this running in parallel in conjunction with each other?
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
Representative Western, it happens during the hearing on the permit. So before the permit is approved, that's when the discussion on the unmitigated impacts comes from the communities. So that's when they appear, the county commissioners appear, the local municipalities appear. There they provide the testimony and the exhibits which document what something might cost, as well as providing the testimony for the additional need. They often use pages of the application itself to justify the need as well, because the analysis is usually done by a outside consultant that evaluates a lot of factors, the existing baseline service needs of the community, what that additional workforce may result or may impact on those services. And so it's a rather exhaustive analysis to go to those, to get to the unmitigated impacts.
Any further questions for Mr. Ash? Representative Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Esch, one of the things that confused me on this, that wasn't clear on the handout is, so you were alluding to the splits between counties. So do they get together beforehand and say, well, we're going to work this out so that we're abutting the cap? Or do they sometimes both submit requests that go way over the cap and then you need to work out the splits? Because I assume you work out the splits at a discretionary level, but do they come to you and do you ask them to come to you with one package proposal, or do you have to work all that out? Do they sometimes both request 100% of the cap and then you gotta have them work together?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray. So when an application is submitted, we send it out to all of the communities in the area where the project will be located. We also encourage those communities to get together and try to work out an agreement on what they believe each county should receive for the impacts of the project. They get together and work to develop an MOU, where they can submit to the council to describe how they believe the impact should be split. I have not seen a situation where each county requests 100% of the 2.76. There have been disagreements amongst counties about where they feel the impacts will be felt more than others, but I have not seen a situation where they're each requesting the full amount. Did that get to your question?
Mr. Chairman, can I follow up?
Sure.
I have two follow-ups. One, so they never together request more than 100%. That you guys make sure that they don't do that. They can't, it appears from the handout. I mean, because the cap, right, is for the entire project. So if you have the project across 2 or 3 counties, right, in theory, they could all submit 80% and be over the cap. But it doesn't appear from the handout that ever happens. Do they just, they never have they don't do that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, yes. Statutorily, the entire project is only allowed 2.76% of the estimated materials cost. So regardless of how many counties it goes across, they can, there's only 2.76. There's only 100% of the 2.76 available. So there's really not much that the council could do there.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more different question.
Okay. Did you have a question? Okay, go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the other question I had was on so you approved the spreadsheet or whatever, the itemized cost for the ambulance. And this whole notion that it's in monthly payments that Representative Heiner was referring to, how does that work? If you've approved one ambulance off of a 0.5 ambulance request, is that all in one lump sum? And then if their estimate of the cost is off, if they're doing it at a premium of 15%, is there any accounting of that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, the statute specifies that the council shall designate an amount and a schedule for payments to each county. So whenever whatever is included in the order of, there's no, I guess I should say there's no itemized list of what each county or municipality is requesting it for currently. The statute, as I mentioned, the statute says you need to provide a total amount and a schedule. So the order comes out and it says, for example, of the, say, 100 million, or probably we'll call it $1 million for impact assistance. Converse County gets 500,000. Natrona County would get 500,000. There's no levels below that on Casper, Mills, or Douglas. It's just the county, and then the county is responsible for distributing it down to the municipalities.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, when this all started, I was in another community, and that community was having some huge impact by large mines. At that time, they negotiated with the city and county on the impacts that they were going to do. We talked about cutting them off and how much money they get and how much money they apply for. These companies did in-kind services for the city and county. One developed an entire subdivision of about 100 houses. Another one did the drainage throughout the community. Huge project, huge irrigation project. You might remember that there was a machine stolen from that project and rampaged through town. And there was bumper stickers that when D9s are outlawed, only outlaws will have D9s. So they actually got more by going in kind than they would have by just getting a payment. So that's the advantage of having this not be money, but a negotiation with the cities and towns, and the Industrial Siting Council wouldn't have to deal with it. I'm sure we won't go back to that, but that's why I'm not in favor of the lesser amount, the least amount we can possibly give them, because those cities and towns, and not just the big towns, but the small cities also have impacts that need to be addressed. And I think if they were addressed by the company, not by the state, they would come up with a lot more creative solutions. So that's my take on it. Thanks, Luke.
Don't you agree?
Mr. Chairman, I couldn't agree more.
Okay. All right, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've got like 20 or 30 questions. So what's the plan? We're going to carry this forward or not?
We'll talk about carrying it forward. You guys have opened up the can, so we'll see here. What I would like to do is we'll take Mr. Esch was the last scheduled speaker. Let's take public comment. I think we'll close that, and then we'll let the committee discuss how we want to move forward. I never did anticipate a final vote today on this at all.
All right, if we're not going to do a final vote, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll just have follow-up side conversations rather than exhaust our time.
And you have no idea how much I appreciate that. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Are there any members from the public that wish to speak on this subject? Any members of the public? Okay, with that, then I will close public comment. And so again, this came to us as a motion at our last meeting to follow up with work that had been done prior. A strong interest of Representative Heiner's, an issue that really cropped up out of the Joint Appropriations Committee dealing with severe budget issues and what they were looking at with it. Great discussion today because, as you can see, there are several different views or ideas of how this could work or maybe work better. The question I put, because I don't have a strong opinion on this one way or the other, so now I can be generous to the committee and say, what do we want to move this draft forward and set up a subcommittee to work on it, dedicate some time at the next meeting, knowing that an hour is obviously not enough to keep working this issue. And I'm seeing some nodding heads. I'm open to any suggestions. I hate to say kick this down the road and look at it next interim, because to me, that's a cop-out. So Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that maybe we move this forward and have a subcommittee that actually works this a little deeper. Because there's so many nuances and the different ideas that were brought today. I don't know that we're ready to just go forward completely with it, but I think it needs more work.
Yep.
If you want me to move it.
Well, I'll just, I don't think we need to do anything. I think we can, the co-chair and I can make that happen. But yeah, Mr. Co-chair.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think we need a subcommittee. We've had a good subcommittee working on this already and doing the things. I think we just need to put it to the next meeting and work at that meeting. I think there'll be a lot of discussion because we've seen what they need. I don't think we need a subcommittee.
So Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I'm always averse to mentioning that I think we need a subcommittee because I'll end up on it, I think we need a subcommittee. And I say that because I think all of the concerns that were raised by Representatives Heiner and Larson, I think are valid concerns, but I don't think this goes far enough to solve all of the concerns. And if we want to do this, I think there's two approaches. One is just a patchwork job, and we can address some of those interests and we could do it next time. So that's an option. The other would be to try and address some of the broader challenges and try and make this process more streamlined, more effective, and also try and accomplish better, I think, the original objectives of it. And it's a perfect task for this committee. Alternatively, we could do one and then have an interim topic next year if we don't do the subcommittee. So I think there are some options on the table, but I don't see why we couldn't do a subcommittee and get this a little better for next time.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I think getting more in the weeds on this bill is a wrong thing to do. I think we have the Industrial Siting Council that can get in the weeds and take care of that. I think if we do a subcommittee, we'll get a lot more other disciplines put into this bill that we don't need. So I still am against a subcommittee, even though Rothfuss would be on it.
So I'm sort of here a little bit because one, I'm not going to run against my co-chair. If we are just to push this topic on, in fairness to everybody that's testified, to everybody that's watching this, it would really be a matter of pushing the draft bill with the proposed amendment forward and limiting our scope to discussing just that and debating just that, which then means we would take up broader issues as an interim topic. Is that, and
that's a good idea.
that is, my concern is I don't want us then to move into November where we'll wrap up other legislation and then have this broad discussion. Once again, we need to have a narrow discussion of, do we push this bill, which again is separately in separate years past both houses, forward with this tiered system in mind, with the concept of we've got to lock down some numbers. And that's what we would look at and what we would try, what I would work for us to limit our discussion to at our next meeting. Is the committee generally on board with that?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Then that's what we'll do.
Fine.
Okay, next topic. Thank you, committee. Great. Go ahead, Representative Gray. You're not in general agreement with me.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Gray,
I
to
was
be in
for the
general agreement with
subcommittee.
me is a smart thing to do, young man.
Mr. Chairman, I was for the subcommittee approach, but
Yeah.
it's okay. One thing I would ask for is if the chairman, I guess I could do it as an individual member, but these research memos, while they answer many of the questions, I'm still not clear. And the questioning really didn't bring out what is the actual accounting for this, because they approve something off an itemized list and it isn't clear what happens to me off of this exchange. So I'd like to get a research memo on what happens to green. I mean, they could just do it off one project like they did on the other one that we.
Yeah. So just a second, Representative Gray, I think, the amendment addresses that particular issue, but Mr. Esch, could you get the committee a memo on what the council does for follow-up on the funds? Is that appropriate for you? Okay. And we did do, maybe if you could, I don't want to give you too much work, but just take a project and as Representative Gray said, this is how this project progressed, what was requested, and then this is how the funds are spent. Is that, I like that approach myself. It gives me a better feel for things. Okay. Sorry, Sandra, I didn't mean to catch you.
No worries, Mr. Chairman. And to Representative Gray's point, I'm going to put together just a conference call with Mr. Esch and ask him my 30 questions, and Representative Gray is welcome to join that. And that way we can do it offline. Mr. Esch will love that. It's a great way to spend the day.
He looks excited.
And I think that's a good way to get the answers rather than having LSO do a memo. Thanks.
Okay. All right, committee, we're set. Everybody, we got our questions in the queue. Know what we're going to look at next committee meeting. Okay. All right, very good. Let's go ahead. We're a little off schedule, but our next report then is from Director Parfit. And Director, while you're getting your chair with your staff, committee, I'll tell you, I don't know if you recall in the House this last year on the floor, Chairman Harshman got up, started asking questions about the Lust Fund. And Chairman Harshman was very good at finding pots of money, right? And then I had to get up and explain where all those funds went and what we had done over the last 10 years, but the last 7 years. And then it dawned on me that I was the only one, maybe with the exception of Representative Burkhart, who knew where those funds went. And I thought, because my political future is always uncertain, that it might be good for the rest of you to learn some of this stuff as well. So, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. And with me is Suzanne Ingalls, the new Administrator of the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division. As the chairman outlined, this is somewhat of a 101, and it'll cover several programs. It'll cover our corrective action account, which is really the crux of it all, which then has an impact on our storage tank program. We don't call it the LUST program anymore. We call it the storage tank program. And then we have our landfill remediation program, and then the orphan site program. There isn't a bill associated with this, but I do want to just remind that we will be working with the Legislative Service Office on a bill for the cease and transfer program, which is required by statute annually. So that'll be an update on the priority list and the projected costs and so forth. So,
And Director, I think we understand, we see that every year. And yeah, again, this is informational, as I got nervous to realize that quite a bit of turnover and not that many people understood these programs, and they're 3 important programs.
yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, yeah, and speaking of turnover, just to point out, of our 7 administrators within the DEQ, we've got 5 new administrators in those positions. So, and Suzanne is one of those, and I think it's been about a month. So, one thing before we get into the presentation slides, I did want to mention that there is a report that we submit annually to the Joint Minerals Committee that covers basically what we're going to be talking about. So if you haven't seen that report, we did submit a report in June that outlines a lot of the materials that we're going to cover today.
Yep. No, I received the report and reviewed it, but I like the pictures better, Director.
Okay, very good. With that, I'm going to ask Suzanne to walk us through the slides, and then we'll take any questions that you have.
All right, so please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Suzanne Ingalls, and like Director Parfit mentioned, I am the administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division. Fortunate enough to be in the position for 6 weeks. Time flies. And I am quickly getting up to speed on the programs, and what I am going to be talking to you today about, like Director Parfit mentioned, are 3 specific programs in the division: storage tank program, landfill remediation program, the orphan site remediation program, and how they interact with the corrective action account. So first up, is the storage tank program. DEQ has been implementing this program since 1991. The point of this program is to ensure that owners and operators of storage tanks maintain compliance with the regulations, as well as provide remediation at contaminated underground storage tank sites. There's 2 financial components to this program: the corrective action account, which funds the remediation work at these contaminated underground storage tank sites, as well as the financial responsibility account. Now, this account provides a financial assurance to operators in the event that contamination at their site causes third-party harm. So that there's that financial component as well. Throughout the state, there is a total of just over 1,600 contaminated sites, and just over 1,300 of those have been remediated by the storage tank program, leaving 290 unresolved sites. Now, the majority of these sites, specifically 282 of those, are currently in corrective action. That leaves 8 sites. And 6 of those 8 sites are scheduled for upcoming work. And as this program, the storage tank program, identifies new sites, those sites are added to the list. And in 2021, 2 new sites were identified, one in Moreland and one in Green River. So I mentioned that the corrective action account funds the remediation work. And this slide shows you where the corrective action account is receiving its funds, and that's through the mineral severance tax. Now that is the equivalent to the tax collected on fuel sold, which is 1 cent per gallon. And that generates approximately $10 million a year. And those funds that are generated through the mineral severance tax are distributed between the financial responsibility account and the corrective action account. And right now, the balance in the corrective action account is approximately 6.4 million. Now, as contaminated sites are identified and brought into the program, those owners are required to pay an annual fee, and those fees generate approximately $400,000, and those funds are also added to their corrective action account. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail about the funds with the corrective action account. As I just outlined, the funds received through the mineral severance tax is added into the account. And DEQ is also able to obtain loans through the Clean Water Revolving Fund, which is managed by state lands. As DEQ requests those loans, those funds are also added to the corrective action account, and we're able to go out and hire third-party contractors to conduct that remediation work. Now, as we go under contract, those loan funds are now obligated. So we have approximately $120.9 million in the corrective action account. And of that, $114.5 million are obligated because of the contracted work. Now, you'll also see a few arrows coming out of the corrective action account pointing downwards towards the landfill remediation program.
Before we go to that, I just, again, on the financial responsibility account, maybe this address the importance of that to our operators, to our fueling stations in the state of Wyoming. Could you just touch on that just a little bit more?
Sure. So that is financial assurance that's federally mandated. Operators are required to have that. And that insurance is rather difficult to obtain. And so the state took that responsibility on and has this financial responsibility account. In the event there is a claim against that operator, we're able to provide that financial assistance.
And so I'll ask this question, maybe it's a softball, but
okay.
But for that account, probably some of the smaller operators in the state of Wyoming and the smaller communities probably would not be able to sell fuel. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chairman, that is very accurate. It really helps those smaller business owners be in operation and have a fuel station in some of those more remote areas of the state.
Thank you. Representative Western. Wait, I don't, is that coming through on the?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There you go.
And so I'm assuming this is all under the connotation of their ability to actually have insurance, because if they don't have insurance, they can't operate because it's too much of a liability for them, correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct. Okay, so going back to this slide in front of us, talking about the arrows coming out of the corrective action account. Back in 2015 and 2018, legislation was passed to allow for distributions out of the corrective action account into the landfill remediation account, as well as the Orphan site remediation account, to allow for work to be done, remediation work to be done under those two programs.
Again, I'll ask this question knowing the answer, but the reason for that is that the corrective action account was working. We were getting orphan sites cleaned up, and then we were there. We knew we were covered in that sphere, but we had this other liability with the leaking landfills. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. It provides a reliable source of funding for those two programs.
Mr. Chairman, I might also add that when the discussions were occurring around the corrective action account, it was made clear in the statute that priority is given to the storage tank program. So we always maintain for fund soundness and our requirements that EPA has for fund soundness. We always maintain a certain amount of funds for the storage tank program.
Yeah, good comments. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, those are actually points on my very next slide.
So the director and I have been doing this too long.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I appreciate the softballs and the confirmation of questions because it helps reinforce what I need to know. So moving on to the next program that I will tell you about is the landfill remediation program. This program was established in 2013 to address groundwater contamination at landfills throughout the state. And this program funds up to 75% of the cost of the remediation for up to 10 years. Now, a lot of work was done prior to the creation of this program, and it was estimated back in 2010 that it would cost approximately $226 million to address the contamination at all of these landfills. And knowing that dollar amount, there were funds appropriated for a total, it was done over time, but for a total of $45 million into the landfill remediation account. And that allowed DEQ to start the remediation work at some of the higher priority landfills. Now, back in 2016 and 2018, there were transfers out of this account into the cease and transfer program to allow work to be done for that program. And that left a remaining balance of $26 million for the landfill remediation account. Now, back in 2015, just like we were talking about, legislation was passed to allow for funds to be transferred out of the corrective action account because it was such a sound account and was working. And it also allows for ensuring the fund soundness for the storage tank program so that they can always do the work necessary and have the funds available. So that was done in 2015. However, there was language included in the legislation that those transfers could not begin until 2019. So those just started to happen most recently. Now, in this program, DEQ is working at 5 of the highest priority landfills, and we're reevaluating the landfills on the list by looking at groundwater monitoring data, looking at groundwater protection standards, revising the cost estimates to try and stay on top of that list and the work that needs to be done. And we're anticipating that the funds for this account to be obligated within the next couple of years, which is why the use of the corrective action account is important for this program. The last program that I'll tell you about is the Orphan Site Remediation Program. This program was established in 2000, and just as it's appropriately called, it allows DEQ to take action at orphan sites to provide that remediation work that's necessary when there's not a viable responsible party, or if the responsible party is not taking action, we can respond to an immediate threat. Another benefit of this program is through the remediation work that is done, it allows properties to be restored to a productive use. in addition to remediating the threats to human health and the environment. So the transfers out of this corrective action account, the legislation was passed in 2018 to allow for a limited amount of funds going to this program compared to the landfill remediation program. And I have a slide in maybe 2 slides that outlines the maximum distributions as well as the actual distributions that were done.
You have a question, Representative Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To jump back up towards the middle of the slide again, the orphan site where no viable responsible party can be identified. Can you explain that to me? How is there not a responsible party identified?
So, Mr. Chairman, in the event, historically, a property might have been a dry cleaner many years ago, and that property has changed hands. There's new ownership, and that previous owner is no longer in business, cannot be found, and that's how we get to there's no responsible party. Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, one on the list is the old sulfur plant north of Warland, which they just abandoned the property. There's nobody around. So,
Mr. Chairman, that's correct, and I believe it's a privately owned now.
so okay, good.
So jumping to slide 10, there are 34 known orphan sites. 12 of those are in active remediation. 10 are awaiting investigation. 4 are considered remediated, and the remaining 8 have been removed from the list. And we have sites located throughout the state, and as
Representative Burkhardt has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Engels, what is PCE? Just for everyone's benefit.
Sure.
Go
Mr. Chairman, it's tetrachloroethylene, and it's a chemical used. It's a very common chemical that was previously used in the dry cleaning industry, and that's where we see it a lot.
Okay, follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm chuckling because one of my very first research memos was on that exact topic. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Engels, the Evanston Roundhouse, wasn't that owned by one of the major railroads?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. That project, my understanding is there is the issue of the roundhouse, and then there's the issue of groundwater contamination. And there was enough uncertainty about who actually was the responsible party. The groundwater portion of that contamination came into the orphan site, and that the program is addressing that contamination.
Mr. Chairman, I might just add to that there is a provision in the statute that if we do find a responsible party after we've done the remediation work, we can go after that responsible party for cost recovery.
Okay. All right, we'll keep going. Thanks. Oh, Representative Wester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at this, and of course I see Sanderson Dry Cleaners in Sheridan. I've always wondered why they had trouble selling that building. But my question is, could you maybe elaborate on just the process of the vector by which tetrachloroethylene gets into the environment? Do they pour it down the drain, it goes into the water system, or is it seep through the concrete into the gravel below the property, or what does that process look like?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it can enter the environment in a variety of ways. We've learned a lot over time of chemical management. And so historically, maybe business owners weren't the best at managing chemicals, or were under the belief that they weren't as detrimental to the environment. And so there are historic practices of just going out back and emptying your barrels of liquids and fluids, or dumping it down the sewer drain. And then there's leaks in sewer pipes where it can enter the subsurface. So that's the most likely path of contamination at these types of sites. And these are all historic. They're not, or I should say historically dry cleaners where it's due to previous operation and management of chemicals. We don't typically see that happening today.
Representative Bear doesn't do that.
I just like to state that Bears Dry Cleaners doesn't use perchloroethylene.
And that's why you Bears dry cleaning. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll jump down to slide 11. And this is the slide that shows the maximum distributions that are outlined like I was mentioning. So you can see the maximum amount that can be diverted from the corrective action account into each program. And it's a staggered amount over time. And one constant that you'll see on this slide is that the maximum amount of funds that can be transferred to the Orphan site program is $1 million. And then also to just reinforce the fund soundness point, the minimum amount that the corrective action account must maintain is that $2 million to ensure that the storage tank program is able to do their work. So maximum amounts are great, but in reality, that's a little bit different. In 2019, in 2020 and 2021, we have the outlined amounts that were done and recommended. And to bring your attention to the most recent distribution in 2021, if you remember, that maximum amount was $5 million to landfill remediation and $1 million to the Orphan site program. However, DEQ recommended a reduced amount of $500,000 to each program because there was reduced revenue to the corrective action account, and we needed to maintain that fund soundness. And lastly, moving forward, the storage tank program anticipates a need of $48.5 million to address the sites on their list in the next 10 years.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ingles, the 48.5 million over the next 10 years, that'd be roughly 5 million a year. What's the, I'll correct my terminology, the 1 cent STP, how much is that generating a year? Is it sufficient to meet the 5 million requirement?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, the mineral severance tax generates approximately $10 million a year, but that also fluctuates. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the last 2 points on this slide is that the landfill remediation program projects a need of approximately $286 million to address the remaining landfills on the list. And the Orphan site remediation program is anticipating a need of $10 million. And that last number is most likely to change because there is the potential to identify new sites over time and bring them into the program where we would be doing more remediation work.
Okay, committee, any questions? Okay, very much appreciate the update. It's good information. I think everybody on this committee should understand that flow of funds and all the environmental liabilities that we're covering and how well you're trying to do the best you can with what you got. And so I appreciate it. So Administrator, welcome to Minerals.
Thank you.
You did just fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item, again, is our voluntary assigned trust. And so I think, Brian, why don't we start with the outline of the draft bill you prepared for us? We've got Director Parfit and then Mr. Wentland and Kimber Wichman. Okay. Also, I think, Mr. Detail, we're going to want to hear from your industry as well. And then I'm so happy Mr. Fleming joined us because I have a couple of questions I want to pursue if we go forward with this that you could be helpful with us on. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Brian or Mr. Fuller.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, you should have 22 LSO 89, working draft 0.5, mine reclamation bonding voluntary assigned trust. This bill would authorize the establishment of a voluntary assigned trust option for the reclamation bond or the financial assurance requirement for mining operations. The bill, Mr. Chairman, starting on page 2, the staff comment just notes that the figures and percentages and kind of that process that's included in this bill for collecting those payments that are deposited into this assigned trust are based on those figures that were included in the department's presentation back in June. And those figures are really at this point, I think, meant just for placeholders. As the committee considers this bill, the committee can certainly amend that process or payment amount how it sees fit. So the bill on page 2, line 16, just adds a subsection to the bonding provisions in the land quality statutes to require rules for a voluntary assigned trust program. This subsection and all the requirements wouldn't become effective until those rules are enacted and take effect. And any voluntary assigned trust program must be consistent with the objectives and purposes of the Environmental Quality Act. And then moving down the bill, it just provides a list of what the rules must include or what the rules must conform to in the statute. So page 2, line 26 just provides that participation in this assigned trust is voluntary on the part of an operator. And if an operator wishes to participate, they must elect to do so to create an assigned trust. The top of page 3, line 4, just working down each of those paragraphs, the amount necessary for an operator to fund the trust must be determined by the land quality administrator in accordance with the provisions of the article and other statutes that concern those financial assurances and the calculation of that amount for a bond or other financial assurance. Page 3, line 9, any payment plan for a voluntary assigned trust can't exceed 10 years for the trust to be fully funded and sufficient to cover the cost of reclamation. It would require an initial payment of not less than 50%. And then the bottom of page 3 require annual payments of not less than 5% until the trust is fully funded and sufficient to cover the cost of reclamation. Moving on to page 4, this would provide that the funds that are received for a voluntary assigned trust must be invested by the state treasurer as authorized by law and in a manner to obtain the highest net return possible, consistent with the preservation of the corpus of the assigned trust. And all earnings from the corpus must be credited to the balance of that assigned trust. Page 4, line 11. The administrator would manage any voluntary assigned trust that an operator elects to create. The assets of that assigned trust are held in trust by the state for the benefit of the operator providing the funds and can only be expended on expenses that are related to reclamation obligations. And then page 4, line 20, any remaining amounts shall be released to the operator in the manner provided for bonds and statute after the funds from the trust are applied to cover all costs of reclaiming the affected land. The staff comment on page 5 just notes whether the committee wishes to consider if the land quality administrator should be able to retain any fees for managing that trust, or if the state treasurer can retain any portion of earnings for investing those funds. The remainder of the bill on page 5 is just a rulemaking section and then a split effective date with the rulemaking effective immediately and the remainder of the act effective July 1 of 2022. With that, Mr. Chairman, happy to answer questions.
I've got quite a few, but I think we'll take the testimony. I mean, we've got some, some questions from Powder River Basin Resource Council on beefing up bankruptcy protection. I want to make sure we address and talk to Mr. Fleming about if the language is broad enough to allow us to go with our latest amendment for funds into equities. But for now, let's go ahead and just keep some of those. This has to be approved by SMACRA, right? Because this is coal only.
That's correct.
Okay.
It will require a program amendment.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Director.
Right,
Sorry.
right. Yeah, and Kyle reminded me, it is just for coal only.
Right.
Portion of it, but if it's related to the non-coal, to the extent that it is, then that's not subject to SMACRA approval.
Right.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. And with me is Kyle Wentland, the Land Quality Division Administrator, and Kimber Wickman, the Management Services Administrator, and also oversees all the bonding for the agency. So just wanted to kind of recap a few things. We presented a conceptual model, and just to reemphasize, it was a conceptual model back in June to the committee. We've had since then discussions with the Mining Association and some of its membership back in July. We've had some preliminary discussions with the State Treasurer's Office as well. And then we've reviewed the draft bill and have some initial comments. I don't have copies of our comments because we were putting those together this week available to the committee, but we'll make those available to LSO.
Director, can you just hit, or Mr. Wetland, whoever hit the high points? I have to imagine some of these revolve around the 10-year payment in full. Can it be, because to me, a partial payment, a partial funding of the trust better than no funding of the trust, and then the minimum 5%. Those are some of the issues I've just wondered about.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I might suggest we have our initial run through of the bill. And I think it would be good if we could walk through that with you and the committee. And then in the close, I think we also have a few points that we simply need a little more time to work through the mechanics of. We saw the bill fairly recently, so this is a pretty quick turnaround. There's just a few items I think are going to require some additional work on.
Yeah, and Mr. Wetland and Director, in all fairness, this was a quick turnaround on committee meetings, a very quick turnaround. And so what I want to do is just make sure we have a good discussion today, identify the key points that we need to work on, let you finish your work. And then my anticipation and co-chair's anticipation is we wouldn't vote on this until our next meeting.
Mr. Chairman, quick question.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Following up on a point you made, you were talking about this being coal only with regard to SMACRA approval. Is this coal only, or is it just that the coal portion of it would have to be approved by SMACRA? Is this all mining operations?
It should be coal only.
So Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that's a good point, because the way this is structured right now, you could go all mining.
Any mining
types.
operation. That's how I read it.
Right. And so to the first part of your question is, yes, SMACRA approval is only for the coal portion. For the non-coal portion, we obviously wouldn't need that. But as this is evolving and with the discussions, and I'll let Mr. Detai with the Mining Association address this as related to other mine types, because there seems to be some interest in moving that direction.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, so this could be in place for in situ uranium mining and things like that also, huh?
Mr. Chairman, as currently drafted, that's correct.
Okay. We'll have a discussion on that. Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, and maybe we can just walk through, if that's all right. I don't think we have anything that's going to take a tremendous amount of time, but.
No, go ahead. Hit them quick.
So, okay. Well, I'll just start and go page by page here. So on the first page, line 2, we talk about the Environmental Quality Council to establish an assigned trust. It's just a cleanup thing. So the Environmental Quality Council would promulgate rules developed by the department to establish a voluntary assigned trust. So that's just a clarification of how the process actually would work. On line 6 of that first page, we would say in trust by the state on behalf of each permit, notification, or license, as opposed to saying operator, because the operator may have multiple permits. And so we wanted to be clear that it applies to each permit.
Which line was that again, Director?
That would be line 6.
So what would it say?
I would say on behalf of each permit, comma, notification, comma, or license.
And I think as long as LSO is getting these down, and we can at the very least have them as staff comments on the next draft. So,
Yeah, and I'll skip over some of the smaller comments here, but we'll provide this to LSO as well. Okay, so on page 2, line 19, similar comment of the assigned trust program for mine permits, notifications, and licenses to bond all or a portion of the full cost of reclamation as determined by the director. Now we put as determined by the director in there because there is a director's bond letter associated with these.
Right.
Okay, so then that takes us to page 3. And this is again reference to the line 5 on page 3. We've added as required by rules promulgated by the council, and that's just a clarification to the process. Nothing, I don't think that's a significant change there. And then on line 10, we have again for each permit, notification, or license. So now with reference to the, and I think this is where the crux of the conversation will go, would be around the time frame in paragraph A.
Director, I'm sorry to
That's all right.
interrupt you, but okay, so you're saying permit, notification, or license.
Correct.
I don't know the difference between notification or permit. What?
So the permit would be, say, for coal, we issue permits for the operation. Notifications would be limited mining operations.
I didn't think those were regulated.
They're bonded.
Okay.
So they carry a bond
Okay.
with them, but there is no permit or license associated with them. But
Okay, Director, I see what we're doing. We're and which
Yeah.
is part of the problem of expanding it past coal this first time
Right.
around. But okay.
And license would be related to the uranium, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. And so now we're if we get to starting on line 12, we're talking about the payment plan for the voluntary assigned trust, which is where the crux of the discussion will go around how many years do they have to fully fund, and then the 50% of the amount for the starting or initial payment. Those are things that I think will be better informed from from the Mining Association, Mr. Detai, and from the State Treasurer's Office.
So Director, I'm not seeing any other questions, but on that particular point, at what level does it become an administrative burden, or does it? If the initial payment was 5% and the payment was over 15 or 20 years, does that create an additional burden to your agency?
I'm going to let Kimber maybe address that if that's all right, because she
go ahead,
handles
Kimber.
the bonding.
Introduce yourself, please.
Kimber Wickman, Management Services Administrator for DEQ and also over the bonding program for the agency. Chairman, to your question, the additional burden isn't so much how much it is, it's how often it can be touched. And that's, can it be fluid or is it more stable? Once it's in the trust, is it there for a certain duration? That's more what causes the administrative. And that's also what I think the Treasury can talk to about how that may limit what returns you may have depending how fluid that is.
Okay, thank you. And that was a little bit of my thought is the trust funds are first in, but they should be, maybe not first in, but they should definitely be last out. Okay, you're nodding your head, so, okay.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, and maybe just to kind of wrap up our comments on the draft, if I can take you to page 5, we're proposing to add some language on line 5, at the end of line 5, that would read, reclamation funds from the assigned trust will be withdrawn last.
Yeah.
bond reductions to the permit notification or license will be made from any other bond instruments first until such time as the assigned trust is fully funded.
Okay, yeah.
To your point.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And along those lines and kind of the logistics of how this would work, this to some degree relates to page 3, the ruminant 3. As you have this transition period where there's a desire to establish this trust and to fully fund the trust, what's the circumstance for surety that augments that trust? I mean, imagine you've got 10 years until you get to a full trust that is providing sufficient surety. Halfway through, we'll say arbitrarily, I've only got half of the required surety. During that period of time, elsewhere in statute, would I be required to have sufficient bonding through other instruments to supplement to the 100% requirement?
So, Mr. Chairman, yes, at all times, each permit would have to have 100% of their bond obligation met through whatever instruments they choose to use.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the next question then is fully funded and sufficient to cover the cost of reclamation. That being the case where you've got an augmentation, why would we even require that it be 100% as an objective, as an arbitrary? I might want a 50% trust or something along those lines as opposed to a 100% trust. This presupposes that I'm going to, in 10 years, achieve a 100% trust. Is there a reason we need that type of specificity? I see a lot of specificity here that I can't justify. And what are your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, when we went down this path and looking at this as an instrument option, if you remember back to our prior presentation, a couple of those goals, one was to reduce risk to the state primarily to start with. The second one is it ultimately, once this is accrued and you're generating income out of it, you're going to free up collateral asset, because when you look at a surety, there's a premium payment, a collateral obligation, in order to do that. So this frees up some of that capacity for a company. So if you're going to go into this, you kind of want to look at it in the long haul of you're all in, because that's where you get the benefit of this.
I totally understand. And I think this is a great program. I really like this concept. That's how I would expect I would want to do it. I just don't know why it needs to be mandated that way, because it makes sense to us if that checks out. Is there a reason why we, the state, need it to be that way?
Chairman Greer, to try to address the question in another manner, is this is an alternate instrument that would be unique to the state of Wyoming offering it. So for the state of Wyoming to put resources to have this option available, it makes sense that the benefit to the state would be that you would be 100% custodian over those, or the goal would be to be 100% custodian of the funds that would then go to reclamation, rather than the current mix of tools in the toolbox for reclamation is somebody could do this on their own somewhere else and do their own mix. But for the state to have RUI being available to the permit, that was the concept of this particular instrument.
Mr. Chairman, I would add to that too, and Senator Office, that the key word here too is it's a voluntary program. And to your other question earlier, on page 2, the reason we put in that it's the revisions in line 19, that is for SMAC or language, so this does not get confused as an alternative bonding system. This is still a full cost bonding system. That's SMACRA compliant language for you.
Different questions, Chairman?
Let me ask,
ahead.
I don't know, did you have a question on that subject? I do. So go, if you. Did you have
You
a
want me to
question
go
on
first?
that? Yeah,
Yeah,
you
okay,
had
I
a
will.
question on that issue.
All right,
Go
I
ahead.
will. On page 2, you mentioned that it could have a mix of bonding and trust and whatever. If I was a mining company and I said, I want to bond for half of it and then put this amount in trust, half of it, wouldn't that be the half could be 100% we're talking about would be the 100% of the half, not the 100% of the total bonding requirement?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson and Co-Chair, I believe if I'm understanding your question correctly, if you have $100 million obligation, you have 50 million in the trust, you have 50 million in a surety, that's certainly workable. You're certainly funded to 100% of the 50%. You've met your full cost obligation. But why wouldn't you continue down the path to 100% and continue to decline your surety over time?
Okay, so Mr. Wetland Director, I'm going to ask a question this way. You can be offended or not, I don't care. We'll make the policy decision on whether these need to go to 100% or not. The question to you is, does it affect your administration of the program, or does it jeopardize us being able to get the plan amendment through SPACRA?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the simple answer to that question is no.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. We understand where you're going with it, and I think most people will, but yeah. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that. And that was a good direct way to get that asked for me. Thank you. The other question I have is, all right, moving forward, imagine that you do have the $100 million fully funded in the treasurer's office, but it's invested heavily in equities. And the value of that falls to $70 million based on the current market value. Would we have a requirement in place then to have augmented surety or to backfill or something along those lines? Would they be required to have a secondary surety to bridge the gap due to the decline in the equity value? I don't see anything in here that would obligate that, but I would suspect that if the value of the surety goes down, then they can't say that it's a $100 million instrument. How is that anticipated to be addressed?
Chairman Greer, I can say in our conversations with Treasury and reviewing the statutes for our federal primacy programs, we are not allowed to inquire a loss on any money given to us for reclamation.
Yep, go ahead.
Even if we're holding it in the Treasury, so you're not allowed to ask the Treasury?
We're not
So
allowed
this-
to take a loss on any funds given to us for reclamation liability. So there is not allowable to have risk of loss.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So with that question, I mean, so I know each bond's reviewed every year, or is it every 2 years?
Every year.
Every year. Okay.
Annually.
But as a component of this, Dan, just so we're real clear on this, because this will solve some questions, is if the funds are put in trust, okay, and they're not anticipated to be used for 20 years, to put those into an equity that could have, that could incur a loss, would not allow us then to qualify under SPACRA for the plan amendments. Is that, you're all shaking your head? Yes.
Chairman Greer, that is correct.
Okay. There's a way around that, but okay. All right, perfect. I got it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to go back to page number 5. And this would be the last significant proposed edit that we have, which would be, again, a continuation from line 5 in the previous edition that we talked about, would be adding a Romanet 7. And the statement would be, the rules shall include provisions and a process for withdrawal from the voluntary assigned trust.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, I think that's all we have right now in terms of the direct edits as being suggested. But we have a few other items that I think need to be considered as we move forward. And Kyle's going to cover that.
Go ahead, Mr. Wetland.
Mr. Chairman, just to outline these, because with working with the draft, in the interim here, we have met with industry one time. We did have a very productive meeting. And we got through several things and raised several questions, obviously, from that meeting. But there are three kind of major hitters here that we're trying to work through yet. One is what happens in a transfer of a permit? How does this trust move with the permit? And do we need some level of clarification language along those lines? So we're still working that part of this. The second item is in particular shielding the account from the bankruptcy. When we look at the section 5 on page 4, you'll see when we get our edits to the LSO, we have some language there. We've been working with the AG on how to phrase and word this maybe into that particular section. We just do not have those comments fully vetted yet with the AG's office. But we are working that language, and I think that might address some of the public concerns. But we just don't have that answer yet for this meeting today.
Which is really key.
It's
So
really
we've got to
key,
get it right.
and we want to get that right. So
Yeah.
we are putting some time, significant time into that one. The third item is then this is just one for consideration as well, and we really haven't had enough time to work this, but precluding the withdrawal of the funds through a substitution right prior to a condition where, let me back up. Let's say you're going into final reclamation, you're in closure, or you're within a year of going to closure, and a company comes in and purchases company A, and they say, we're going to substitute the bond with another instrument like a surety and take all of the cash out of the assigned trust. And we're thinking we may want to have some provisions about limiting that withdrawal at the end like that, so the state doesn't get left with the surety and then maybe somebody walking out the door. Does that, sorry to be simplistic about it, but that's.
Yes, and I think we all understood that you wouldn't be able to do anything like that, but go ahead,
Right.
Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, that was on the next question I was going to ask. Wasn't even a transition late. There was just a suggestion that the rules on a Romanet 7 be included for withdrawal from the program. My assumption is withdrawal from that program means withdrawal of the funds as well that are associated with that trust. So I can imagine a circumstance where I'm a business that's flush, I'm doing well, I have sufficient resources for the first 5 years of my 10 years, I'm filling the coffers, and now I reach a moment of financial hardship where all is going to hell. And I think, well, I've got this fund over here that I'm going to use as capital to reinvest in my company, and I'm just going to buy access to the bond for a short period of time. So I liquidate the trust and then buy a temporary bond, and all we've done is serve as effectively a checking account for the corporation in the good times. What's to prevent that? I see nothing, and I actually would expect that to happen in every occasion where we would have a problem. So how do we get around that?
And Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, that's why I said that's a third point that we're working. We just got to have a little more time with the bill.
Yeah, no, and it's a valid point, and I guess my overall vision on this, I'll just say it was just simply the last funds out for reclamation, and any remaining funds are only returned once you get a certification of completion. And that, I think you just say that in statute, you don't worry about rules. That's what it is. Yeah. And that should also help the bankruptcy issue too, when you look at the totality of the trust.
And Mr. Chairman, again, that's why we're working those kind of couple key points with the AG, because we got to get it right.
Yeah.
We got to get that right.
Understand. Okay. All right. All right. We'll keep moving. It's general public comment, but I want to hear from Mr. Deti. I want to hear from, yep, go ahead. Okay, you have a question for DQ? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess my question to DQ or Mr. Wetland is, in some of that follow-up stuff that you guys have still yet to complete, is there going to be any outline in terms of, premature withdrawal from this trust? So let's say, if their obligations are $100 million, they deposit, say, 50 million in this trust, eventually to be accumulated up to the full obligation of 100 million. But for whatever reason, they have to reclaim on that for reclamation costs. And my question is this: that 50 million that's left in the trust that's being managed by the Treasury's office, if it's generating 5% a year on return, I assume all of the revenue generated, the interest generated, would be folded over into the reclamation costs as well, correct? Or I'm assuming that would be the basic function on that interest and return generated.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the answer is yes, because it's by individual permit. Okay.
Okay. All right. Any further questions for DQ? Okay. Well, thank you. We appreciate the work, but you got more to do, right? and like quicker too.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to, it's for public comment. We'll give everybody an opportunity, but I do want to hear, I think I'm going to go Mr. Detai. Then I want to hear from Shannon Anderson with some of the bankruptcy language. And then Patrick will get you up, and then so you can be on your way if you wish to be so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Travis Detai, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Mining Association. And I will start off, first of all, thanks for holding your meeting in Laramie. This is my hometown, and I grew up literally a block and a half from where we're sitting right now, and I can see my house from the front door of this building. And my family sold it to the University of Wyoming about 3 or 4 years ago, and the lawn looks terrible. So maybe Senator Rothfuss, maybe you can get on that. And Mr. Chairman, before I start, I'd like to just take the opportunity to give you kind of a little snapshot of where your industries are today. Our coal industry is doing better than we were last year, where production is up about 9.5%. We have companies that are hiring right now. And 9.5% over last year's dreadful year is not much of a benchmark, but we're doing a little bit better. Gas prices are a little bit up, and nice warm weather, and the economy coming back is boding well for our coal guys right now. So we're doing a little bit better than last year. On the uranium side, we got news yesterday that the request for information for the domestic uranium reserve went out in the Federal Register yesterday. And we're hopeful that we can start producing again in this state. We're a little concerned at the federal level on uranium with the efforts to remove uranium from the critical minerals list. So we're working with our congressional delegation to make sure that doesn't happen. On the Trona side, we're back to pre-COVID levels on production. Prices are still down, and expansion projects are going forward. So there's some good news on that front. And our bentonite guys with the pet litter industry are doing quite well. And I would encourage everybody to support your industry and buy another cat. And with that, I think Administrator Wentland and
Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, that uranium storing by the federal government, that did not say that it was going to be bought in the United States, did it? It just said they were going to have a strategic deposit.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, no, the goal is to buy American uranium for that stockpile.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, so it's some good news. There are a lot of headwinds still, but we'll take good news where we can get it. Mr. Chairman, I think Director Parfit and Administrator Wentland and Kimber kind of addressed some of our concerns with the original draft bill. And I want to thank the LSO and the committee for moving expeditiously on this. This is a new concept, but I think we do have a lot of work to do still. We had a really good productive meeting with the coal operators last month. Got some things figured out, but I will just hit a couple of points. And I think Director Parfit and Administrator Wentland hit these pretty well. We think the 10-year language should come out. And I think Senator Rothfuss, you hit it perfectly. We want this tool to be flexible. I think the ultimate goal for a company would be to get everything into an assigned trust. But short term, you may have a company that wants to do 70% in the trust, 30% self-bonded, whatever, to use the tool. So we don't think the 10 years is necessary. And just to keep that flexibility for an operator, because all operators are different depending on their current financial situation at the time, and they should have the opportunity and the flexibility to cover their bond with the tools that we give them. And then the second item in the bill was the initial payment of 50%. And again, that's coming from the conceptual presentation that was given last week. That is too high for most of our guys. We are working with the agency to kind of hit that sweet spot. We will be having another meeting early next month to figure out and work the numbers. And frankly, it's it would be the preference of the industry to see those numbers dealt with in rule rather than in statute, and that's just for the committee's consideration. Finally, I think once we hear from the state treasurer's office, that will add more information to the discussion. And we fully expect that there may have to be some sidebars on this stuff that we're going to have to work out. And on the coal side, anyways, we're prepared to work through those issues next month. We do like the way the language is drafted so that it applies to all the other industries too. We're working the coal side just because of the SMACRA component right now. But this concept has generated considerable interest from the locatable mineral side, specifically the uranium and the bentonite operators that are very interested in doing this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Committee, any questions for Mr. Dutine? Okay, I just okay, we'll go forward with all of them. You got to give me your solemn promise that we're not going to get into 3-hour, 4-hour meetings over gravel.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Legursky's not here right now, so I'm going to defer that one to her. Those guys aren't my guys. I will do my best though.
My concern is I've seen very good ideas get killed because we took too big of a bite.
Yeah, that's understood, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, may I have one other second before I?
Sure.
Senator Anderson, you mentioned, I really appreciated you bringing up the D9 dozer incident in Gillette a few years ago. The Wyoming Mining Association held our annual convention up in Gillette a couple of weeks ago, and kudos to your city for doing an outstanding job of hosting us up there. It was a great convention. We had the opportunity to honor Senator Enzi the night before his bike accident. We had 300 people there, and he got up and spoke, and he told that exact story of the dozer, and he talked a lot about what he'd done for Gillette. And he was a member of this committee. And I just want to, what a good man and what a loss for the state. We need more people like him. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll get off the dais here.
All right. Thanks, Travis.
Thank you.
Yeah. Shannon, would you come up next, please?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. And I apologize also for the lateness of this, but I did give you a handout. I have been phoning a friend. So we have counsel at a law firm called Moy White in Denver that we've worked with for years now to address the impacts on coal bankruptcies. So I've been consulting with them a little bit on some of the language. And specifically, I think as the DEQ identified that language in subsection in Romanet 5. And just so you know, I mean, the word assets is pretty charged in bankruptcy parlance. That is what you go after in a bankruptcy in terms of who collects during a bankruptcy proceeding, and the assets are really what's available for collection. So we're very concerned about the use of that particular word in that section related to, again, the assets being associated with the operator or the permittee or whatever language we end up using versus the assets really of the state that would then be available for use. And really, there's two situations where we believe these funds can be called upon. It should be clear that these are the only two situations. The first is in the situation where the operator or the permittee applies successfully for bond release. And so they get a portion of that money back. I think the language proposed earlier about that this is the last resort in the case of a bond release makes a lot of sense. And then the second case is, of course, when there's a bond forfeiture proceeding. And this is what we really care about in terms of making this all work, right, for the state. And so we need to make clear that until those two situations happen, that these are assets that are protected and not held by or could be used during a bankruptcy proceeding for the operator. So that's where we're coming from there. The other proposed amendment we have relates again to just some language I think that needs some cleanup in the bill. The bond amount is not just the cost of reclamation, it's the cost of reclamation done by the state. And so that's the difference, is that it's not the operator's cost of reclamation. Is if in the case of bond forfeiture, the state has to come in, hire a third-party contractor, and then carry out that reclamation work. That is marketably more expensive than the cost of reclamation. So again, just to use, I think, the right language that DEQ had as well, that, you know, the bond amount is set by the director, not the administrator. And it's really the amount that's necessary in the case of bond forfeiture. I think we also had, again, some questions about what happens if there's a loss on this investment. I appreciate DEQ's response that we can't incur a loss, but I think there is a question, if it is invested and there is a loss, then what happens? And just to make it there needs to be clear in the statute who backfills that amount, how it happens, when it happens, and all of that. So those are our main, I think, 3 points. I would agree, I think, with DEQ that one of their main questions about a permit transfer is also important to think about. And I think associating the fund directly with a permit may help to solve that question, as opposed to with an operator. And again, sort of switching that language out in the statute, I think makes sense. And then I do also agree with their questions and concerns about bond substitution. And I think there was a little bit of misinterpretation. Again, this is complicated stuff. So it's different than bond release. And so bond release, of course, occurs when the reclamation work has been done. The permittee applies to have a portion of that reclamation released from bond. Bond substitution occurs when an operator just substitutes out a type of a bond. So for instance, when an operator goes from self-bonding to surety bonding, or from surety bonding to cash bonding to collateral bonding, any kind of type like that. And that's done, it can be done at any time really, but it is often done through that annual report process that operators have when the bond amount is reviewed. So if the bond amount is reviewed, again, it's reviewed at an annual basis. And let's say that the amount is 20% higher just randomly than, the year before, the operator has to cover that additional amount in financial assurance instruments. Sometimes they may elect to have a different financial assurance instrument for that additional amount. There's also specific requirements for bond substitution, specifically for self-bonding. When an operator becomes ineligible for self-bonding, bond substitution has to occur within 90 days. That's specific to self-bonding, but that's another situation where, again, bond substitution does happen at the permit level. So it's a little different than the final release of the bond, and again, could occur throughout the life of the permit. So we agree with DEQ that I think it'd be good to clear that up. I think you have challenges with just the use of the voluntary word throughout the statute. It is the permittee's, I think, election on whether or not they use this instrument and how often they use it and to what amount, as long as you're using that voluntary word. So just something I think for you to think about as you move forward. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. We appreciate it. Mr. Fleming, appreciate you coming. So have you introduce yourself and then answer the question is how much money could you make off of this, off these funds?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Patrick Fleming. I'm CO for the State Treasurer's Office. And also we have Katie Smith, who's Director of our Accounting and Operational Division 2. So we'll split it if you have the accounting or how the fund would actually be operated. Katie can address those comments and I'll address the investment income. Mr. Chairman, your comment about what we can make from it, it all determines what you would say the rules and regulations would be. So as a previous speaker talked about on the loss situation, who's at loss? Are these companies willing to take a 50% loss in an equity market and draw down? Or if you're only looking for a government guarantee. So when you're saying how is the only way that we know we won't take a loss? And that's pretty much just talking about US Treasuries. Mm-hmm. So wonderful news is right now 3-month T-bills are yielding 5 basis points. So you go out to 10 years and you're 1.35% on a 10-year Treasury. So that's the reality that we face. Rates are historically low and extremely problematic for these type of investments when you're looking for a real return. Now, if you wanted to step out on the risk spectrum, you can go as far as you want. Once we go into different issues on risk, then you're saying, do all of these companies want to have the same risk spectrum? And if that's not the case, which I assume is how it would be, then you're talking about an operational situation that Katie could address that would dramatically impact our ability to manage these funds.
Committee, any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead.
You actually wouldn't make the money. That money stays in that trust for the reclamation, correct? State of Wyoming does not benefit from this, as I understand it.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, yes. In our previous conversations with Director Parfit, that would be a question I think needs to be addressed, because from my perspective, if I were one of these companies willing to do so, if I did not have access to that interest income, the amount of money that I would put forth into this, if this was going to be rolled into the fund, would be smaller. Conversely, if you're a fund sitting there going, hey, we have excess amount of cash, whether we put it with a state and we can reduce this amount or put it into a money market, you'd be better off, obviously, to put it into this fund. So I think that is a very important component of where the interest income would go. Would it go to the state and roll up into this fund, or would it go to the fund itself, the participants?
Okay, any other questions? So I think we have two fundamental questions. One is the interest income, or the earnings off of each individual fund, which I had envisioned would just stay with each permit, would stay within that fund. It helps with inflation proofing. So we always have to look to worse times. So then the next component of it, and I think we've got a little bit of an answer, but we should explore this a little bit further, is can risk be assumed within the individual assigned trusts? And that means if it can't lose money, then no, there can't be any risk. But we also know that idle money loses every day, right? Because of inflation. So I think we need to answer that fundamental question of what we can do. We manage the Wildlife Trust Fund. It was Amendment B, I forget what we call it now, because we know funds aren't going to be used for 20 years. So we can look at a long-term view of what can be invested in equities and make decisions off of that. And that's, I think, one of those things that we're going to spend a little more time on and maybe have a secondary discussion. But the first one is, does that still allow us to be in compliance with SMACRA and work towards that goal? with respect to the other minerals, I think we can do that as a matter of state policy. So Patrick, I'm sorry, that wasn't really a question. I'm just trying to outline some of these complex issues we have before us.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. If, if you look at degrees of risk, if you want to say, what are the other funds available and how much risk, I'm assuming you're talking the state would then take on that potential loss, or if that's the case, we've just implemented a short duration transition portfolio that is now would be approximately 2%. It takes on more risk. It's a combination of CLOs, investment grade, high yield, and it has a loss characteristic since inception of around 5% maximum drawdown. The bond portfolio that the state is invested in now, it's called core fixed income. The highest drawdown on that investment grade portfolio was 13%. So those are bond-ish types of risks, and you all know the equity component of what we're talking about.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, just another thing to have a discussion, this would have to involve industry and DEQ, is from an administrative standpoint, with the treasurer's office, we need to identify the added cost of management of these assigned trusts, and that needs to be identified. The second component we need to look at, which wasn't addressed in the draft legislation, is a minimum amount. So when we move into other, we don't want to set this up for $50,000. We need to look at what makes the most sense from the size of an account, and then what are the costs to the treasurer's office of segregating these funds and tracking them, if there's an additional cost. Maybe it isn't.
Mr. Chairman, could I comment a couple things from the investment perspective that would be that we would need to know is, first of all, with the monies going in, would they ever be able to withdraw those funds? So if it's there and stays there for 10 years, that would change what assets we'd be able to invest in. That's very important from that perspective. A couple of these alternatives that we'd look at, if you're familiar with the WyoStar 1 and WyoStar 2 account, which we have for the local entities, that would be something from an administrative cost that would be de minimis because we already have those. WyoStar 1 is just a money market fund. WyoStar 2 invests more in corporate bonds and short duration corporate bonds and has a little bit of risk, but has something less. The other component would just be the language that you have in this bill that if it's all right, could I address a couple? So first, addressing on page 3, the 50% and the accretion to 100% over time, that would be very important to know whether or not that amount stays, as I just alluded to. And then more importantly, on page 4, line 5, when you're talking about net, and maybe Brian could comment on this, but are you referring to net after fees in that? Because that typically that is not a term that's discussed, but then this phrase, the return possible consistent with the preservation of the corpus of the assigned trust. The way that we would read that is you're talking about a loss is not permitted.
Right. I can't speak for the full committee, but I would just assume that the initial 50% in 10 years doesn't exist in the final draft of the bill.
And Mr. Chairman, the assurity that those funds will not be moved would be extremely important in the because if the funds can be taken out, then you're talking about 4 basis points.
And Mr. Fleming, I think just from what I heard from the discussions is there can't be a surety that they're not going to be taken out to a time certain because we obviously don't know the future, but the concept of those are the last in and they can't be substituted or withdrawn until the end is, I think, the assumption most of us are looking at. So we probably need to have a more in-depth discussion on some of the more technical components of what we can and cannot invest in.
So, Mr. Chairman, we have a similar situation with this, with our state agency pool, the 4 billion that we have for the various entities. So they cannot incur a loss. And so what we do is we manage those funds internally. And what we do is we purchase ladder strategies that as they come down. And so one suggestion I would have for the committee that we could see is you could do a ladder strategy, potentially with corporate bonds as well. That would get you, right now, the corporate spreads in a 1 to 3 year index would be around 55 basis points. So it is still very low, but we're not 5. So there are those types of strategies we could do as well. But then the operational side of that would be different as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, another consideration would be to have an expectation, but recognize that you might fail that expectation. So if it's a 20-year project, minimum expected time before you start utilizing those funds would be 20 years, then we could statutorily have a backstop of if you have bankruptcy and cleanup beforehand, we've got an internal fund which we would draw upon, but your instrument would still be invested for 20 years or 10-year bonds, whatever you wanted to do. I think there are a number of ways to work on it so that we could get to a legitimate investment strategy and still provide for the odd contingency where we have the funds available. We wouldn't want to just say, well, we need all the funds tomorrow, let's put it in the agency pool and have a low return or even the 4 basis points you were mentioning.
Yeah. And again, with these permits were reviewed annually. So, okay. Good points to discuss. I think we're going to have a little more discussion on that point. I wouldn't let this particular point get in our way of moving forward with the legislation. If nothing else, we can have it set there as a bill, just with no risk, right? Just a very small amount, return back in, and we'll have 3 or 4 months to work on an investment strategy. We wanted to bring it later before the session too. So Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've talked a bit about risks involved for this fund, but what about inflation risks? How do we set up an amount for the fund, and it may not be utilized for 10 or 20 years, but inflation is a serious contention for that. When the inflation rises, how do we prevent this fund from devaluing in the value of our money?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, as the chairman mentioned about inflation proof, well, right now, CPI year over year inflation is 5.4%, and you're getting 5 basis points. So this is not inflation proofing. Securities that we look at to try and that you can purchase are called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, or U.S. government securities. That is something that you could look at. It's based on the CPI. So that would be something that you could look at. Right now, a 10-year tip is break even is 2.35. So what that means is that if inflation over the 10-year period was above a 2.35%, then you would get the monies above that. But if it's below, then it would be a loss situation. So it's still not free of potential losses over a 10-year period, but you would potentially be protected from inflation. The other assets obviously are hard assets, real estate, other things, but those would have a higher degree of risks.
Okay, committee, any further questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Patrick. And I think for Kate, we're fine on. I think you kind of covered our with what you're doing with the locals, kind of answer some of the questions for us there. So, anyone else from the public? Any public comment on this particular topic? Okay, we'll close public comment. I don't know if there's is there any action the committee really wants to take right now? I mean, I think my thoughts would be is let DEQ and the industry continue to work through what would work. I'd like to take some consideration of the language on the bankruptcy stuff from the Powder River Basin Resource Council, compare that with what the AG comes up with. Is it unreasonable to get a revised draft to the committee by October 1 that we could look at well in advance of our November meeting? No one's saying it's unreasonable. Mr. Wetland.
Mr. Chairman, we've scheduled a meeting with industry for early September for the next go. We should have some results back from the AG fairly soon. We had, just some timing issues there and availability with folks. I think probably October 1 or maybe mid-October, there's probably realistic. I'm going to have a little bit of, my time is going to be a little limited here for personal reason here coming up too in early September. So.
Okay. Well, why don't we shoot the committee, unless there's any objections, just look at sort of a redraft consistent with the comments that were made. I think, Brian, as we do that, we can hit staff comments on more of the policy issues. And then maybe we can get a few committee members once we get some answers on where the investments could go. I don't think we let the investments get in the way, the investment strategy get in the way of some good legislation. But I think we should, as a committee, continue to explore that. Okay. With that, we are significantly behind time. So we've got a break scheduled at 12 o'clock with lunch coming in to get an update from EORI. Mr. Coddington, and do we want to jump in? And Sarah, do we want to jump in on the carbon credits? I guess the question is report from EOR. So here's the problem. We start on it, we take a break for lunch. We'll have to finish up the discussion while we're all eating. Are you comfortable with that? Okay. I don't see there, Sarah. Okay. Yeah. All right then. Well, let's go ahead and move on in. We'll knock out about 15 minutes here and see where we want to go. This is more of a conceptual discussion. So Mr. Coddington, welcome back. Ms. Fitzgerald, welcome back. Getting around all right? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's see. We also had Dr. Morale, if you want to go ahead and come on up too. I don't think the microphone's on.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chairman. I think Dr. Morel is planning to be here to answer questions and things like that, but
okay.
He doesn't have anything to present. So.
Okay, so we had a sort of a conceptual draft that was submitted by LSO. I don't know what I did with my draft. Do the two of you want to start I know you worked with LSO on this, so why don't we let you guys just go ahead and tackle what you were thinking and what you went through and so forth.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's good to be back talking about this again. It's a topic that is continually fascinating and ever changing. So in addition to the bill draft that you all have, there's also a report called Carbon Markets and Credits in your materials. And that report includes a table of potential solutions. If you'd like, I'll walk through those 4 potential solutions, and then we can talk about the bill draft, because I think there's a kind of a suite of potential things that the state can look at as it relates to voluntary carbon markets.
Sarah, can you tell us which bill draft you're talking about? Are you talking about LSO 0124?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. So, before I jump into those solutions, I think it'd probably be useful just to kind of recap where we've been with this topic and kind of where we've come from and where we have come since the June meeting. You all know that CO2 development, CO2 project development, CO2 technology and research development is something that the state has been a leader in for quite some time. And in part due to this committee's good work, we've made a lot of good investments in advancing that industry over the past decade or two. Recently, we've seen also, in addition to the state partnered projects like the ITC and Carbon Safe, we've seen an uptick in private companies who are trying to take advantage of the opportunity that looks like it's being presented by the private sector, which is a drastic increase in demand for CO2 credits. And so we, at the Business Council, we really got into this by trying to see if there's a way for us to help, us as a state to help those companies better take advantage of the opportunity that we see. These companies, including the big CO2 sequestration projects, as well as new technology companies, there are a number of ways to monetize CO2 currently that work to some extent, including 45Q credits, things like that. But we hear time and time again that that's just not quite enough to capitalize these projects. And so that's kind of the problem that we're looking at. That brought us to looking at voluntary carbon markets. And just a quick note on voluntary versus regulated carbon markets, really, really important distinction there. We're not looking at anything that remotely resembles cap and trade or set pricing or anything like that. We are strictly looking at how can Wyoming businesses better leverage what's going on in the private sector to sell carbon credits to folks who want to buy carbon credits. And that market is really being driven by investment that's concerned with environmental, social, and governance issues. And like I said, we just have seen a drastic increase in that. But the way that market works right now, if you want to buy or sell a carbon credit, there are a number of exchanges that you can go to. That works for many, but there are some kind of inefficiencies. Each of those exchanges has different sets of definitions for what a carbon credit is, and those are called methodologies. And those are not the same as you go from exchange to exchange or from registry to registry. And what that does is it creates, whether if you're on the buy side of a carbon credit transaction or on the sell side of a carbon credit transaction, it's really hard to know what the fair price is. It's also really hard with the way the market currently works. It takes a long time and it costs a lot of money to get one of those definitions, one of those methodologies approved, especially if you've got a new technology. So for companies in Wyoming who are developing new technologies to reduce CO2, as well as for some of the main ways that we could potentially leverage this opportunity, like CCS and CCUS, though that long time frame, that high cost of entering these markets is a barrier. And so we think that there are some potential solutions to solving that. And so if you look at your table that you've got there in that carbon credits and markets report, we've put together 4 potential solutions for how we might help Wyoming companies, Wyoming CO2 project developers, as well as Wyoming ag producers and energy companies overcome some of those problems. The first directly addresses that long time frame high cost of entering the market. We think that by developing technical assistance and or grants for companies who are looking to enter these carbon markets, that can help shorten those timeframes, potentially help lessen the costs of entering the markets, and therefore help those companies reduce the risk of entering a new venture like that. The second I'll let Kip talk about, which is developing a methodology for geologic sequestration in saline reservoirs.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated in my testimony on June 25th, at the moment and to the best of our knowledge, there is no methodology that exists for the generation of voluntary carbon credits for geologic storage in saline formations. So merely facilitating the creation of such a methodology would help those projects in Wyoming and elsewhere, and in particular, Wyoming Carbon Safe. Thank you, Sarah.
Sure.
One question, why is the CO2 storage so much difference in the saline as opposed to any other reservoirs?
Well, the formation types are different, but these methodologies go to topics such as monitoring and verification. And so, for example, if you're monitoring CO2 in an active CO2 EOR flood in a reservoir that's shallower than a deep saline formation, it would be a different type of monitoring technology and approaches. So at the end of the day, it is all geologic storage, but these methodologies are really targeted for specific project types and technology types. So saline storage would require a separate methodology.
Thanks, Kip and Mr. Chairman and committee. One thing I'd add to that too, a question that I received earlier this week is, we have Carbon Safe, we have Class 6 wells, don't we already have a methodology for doing geologic sequestration in saline reservoirs? And it's just a nomenclature thing. The methodologies, the technical aspects are there and very well defined. It's just that what's called a methodology by voluntary carbon registries, there's just not one that's been accepted by those voluntary carbon registries. So just a point of distinction there. The second, or the third and fourth options on your table, I'll talk about together because those are, I think they're kind of one and the same, essentially, because the first is developing a new Wyoming CO2 regulatory framework. The second is just codifying what kind of frameworks are already being developed and established in the private sector. I think they are very related to each other because we see in that in item number 3, in order to develop a new Wyoming CO2 framework, that really needs to be something that is complementary to what the private sector is doing, and not totally separate from it. So I'll talk about those to get together, and that's really what what has resulted in the bill draft 0124 that's in front of you. Brian from LSO did draft up this bill. I don't know if Brian, would you like to walk through it? And then we've got some commentary that we can add to that. What's the best way to do that?
Yes, I am control. Thank you, Representative Burkhart. But I'm trying to be nice today, so it's okay. Yeah. No, I think that'd be fine. So, a little bit, I recognize this framework very well. And it is a framework to set some bones with rulemaking, but I think one of the key things you have to keep in mind is that it is to accommodate and provide a regulatory framework to legitimize or to help stand up private business in this sector. And so I know Mr. Robitaille, I see him in the audience. I'd be curious about his comments on this, so forth. But Brian, why don't you hit it real quick? You don't have to go in great detail. Just hit the high points. These are definitions. This is the advisory group. This is a rule. This is a rule. Okay.
You got it, Mr. Chairman. so 22 LSO 124. And yeah, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, particularly for those members of the committee who were on the committee in the last legislature, this framework is based on the sage grouse mitigation credit bill draft that was enacted a couple of years ago, where a framework for a program was put into statute, the remainder and the details being developed by rule. Mr. Chairman, as you said, the definitions are there to provide some backstop to make sure that any sort of carbon credit, or the nomenclature in the bill is carbon token, that those credits that are generated are verifiable, they're enforceable, and they're additional to something that, compared to something that's already being done. And it has to be measurable as well. The program itself, this is on page 5, is developed and then provides, moving to page 6, there's a creation of an advisory group that would be that would review and evaluate carbon credit providers, those that verify the creation of carbon credits and their applications. They would also provide technical assistance as required. It would be 5 state employees and then 4 residents of Wyoming representing different groups. So oil and gas, agriculture, utilities, and conservation. And then the rulemaking, this begins on page 8. And it would just be criteria for creating the carbon credits, rules for marketing, registering, transferring, and selling carbon credits, eligibility criteria for those who provide carbon credits, as well as eligibility criteria for those who would verify the creation of carbon credits. The rules would also require that any sort of credit that's created is done so in Wyoming. It provides audit requirements to ensure that the carbon credits are in accordance with the act and any rules that are promulgated. And then, Mr. Chairman, I wasn't sure about including this, but on page 11, financial assurance requirements for carbon credit providers. My brief research didn't reveal anything like that. I think that's a policy decision for the committee to decide if any sort of, say, bond for a carbon credit provider is or is not necessary.
Well, Mr. Fuller, I think, this is a question that Mr. Coddington can answer, because he's dealt with private contractual transactions as what financial assurances are typically included in those transactions.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. And actually, before I answer that question, I want to commend Brian Fuller and LSO for coming up with this draft language on such a short notice. It really is heroic work. The short answer to the question is no. You would not have financial assurance backstopping a carbon credit in a voluntary market.
Okay, that answers your question, Brian.
Yeah. And then, Mr. Chairman, just to wrap up, there's just language that says that you can't, approve a credit unless it's, the credit provider's been approved under this framework. It allows whatever department is running this program to bring a civil action if a carbon credit provider, if that credit fails to maintain whatever reduction in emissions supposed to be, this enforceability mechanism. And then it also provides a grandfather for any carbon credit provider that's been approved under another market, that they can participate in this framework either until a date certain, which in the bill is just set at January 1st of 2025, or they are approved under the Wyoming framework. Mr. Chairman, I think the only other thing I would mention would be the fee. 2 things, I guess. First, the fees. Whether there should be any fees associated with this. There's language on pages 14 and 15 that provide for an application fee as well as an annual fee, and a couple of different approaches, whether that fee amount is set in statute or whether it should be set by rule. I think that's a decision for the committee. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, way back on page 3, and then going into page 4, you'll notice that there's a definition for department, and that is left blank. The question of who would manage and create this program is one that the committee would need to decide.
Okay, good. That's a nice quick overview. Thank you. So committee, any questions on that structure? Yeah, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Ms. Fitzgerald. Back during your testimony, you were talking about these voluntary carbon markets and the methodology needed for this new or future types of carbon management. What makes a voluntary market accept a methodology that the state might develop?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Barrett, that's an excellent question, and I'll ask Kip to help chime in on that too. But that's really one of the key factors that we have been looking at in terms of what any action by the state needs to do is make sure that the state of Wyoming is looked at, or in this framework, whatever we set up, is looked at as something that is objectively credible to the market and specifically to buyers of CO2 credits. And so those would be big corporations. That's kind of like one of the biggest customer groups, big corporations who are setting, zero emission goals, net zero goals, things like that. I believe that in order to establish that credibility, it's key to facilitate what the private sector, what the market is doing, and create just a regulatory framework that helps facilitate what's already going on in the market, just like Chairman Greer said, rather than establishing kind of new rules or new things that might be contradictory to what the market currently already accepts. The other thing that I think might be that might help with that credibility is to make sure that the people who are making any decisions involved with this, so it would be that kind of advisory board that's in the bill, is diverse enough that it's looked at by the CO2 buyers as a credible body.
So, Mr. Chairman, actually, I can add to that. Okay. Representative Bayer. So, to answer your question, you would, all these voluntary carbon markets that are implemented through different registries, they all have rules and procedures you have to follow to get a new methodology created. So the first step would be identifying what market you wanted to go to. Then you would pull down their rule book about how you propose a new methodology. And generally it involves retaining a consultant. Generally there's peer review, there's a public notice and comment period. So all this is transparent, and it's almost similar to how a government agency would go through notice and comment rulemaking. But there are detailed procedures that all these carbon markets follow internally before they will approve a new methodology.
Yep. Any other questions, Representative Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I really don't agree with just conceptually this whole approach. It's kind of like how I approached the sage grouse bill a couple years ago. Just the action of buying these voluntary credits, and I know they're voluntary, but the action of sort of an anti-fossil fuel, radical left individual in a big city who feels the need to buy an offset for an airplane ticket, or United Airlines that is buying an offset for quote unquote emissions. It's in and of itself an attack on our way of life, on huge core industries in our state that are huge for our state. So why on earth would we codify that and provide it any legitimacy? It doesn't make really any conceptual sense to me. So would you agree?
Thank you, Representative Gray, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mrs.
I think a lot of that is policy decisions, and it's up to the committee and up to the legislature. What I will say is that we are seeing we are getting requests from the private sector asking for this market to be to have some more consistency so that it works efficiently. And so the interest here is in helping Wyoming businesses access this market.
All right. Any other questions? Do you have any more?
Yeah, we have a couple of comments, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
go ahead.
I think that there's a lot of, I think it's worth pointing out some kind of parallels with the sage grouse credit market that that has recently been implemented, and with what's proposed in this bill, because there are some key similarities and some key differences that I think will be good to keep in mind as we move forward. When it comes to CO2 credits, as we've been talking about, there is already a functioning market that buyers and sellers can access currently. It's just that there are some inefficiencies, and it sounds like the market needs some more certainty that that the state of Wyoming could potentially provide. And so rather than setting up an entire kind of soup to nuts market, including debits and credits and kind of the entire process, all the state, I believe, needs to do in terms of voluntary carbon markets, as opposed to sage grouse markets, is just provide the credibility and provide the certainty across those different exchanges and registries. And so for that reason, I would suggest looking carefully at how debits are considered, because debits in this world can look like emissions. And so making sure to avoid that there's no unintended consequences of setting prices or anything like that. That's really kind of the main thing that I wanted to point out in terms of just the differences between sage grouse and CO2. And in going along with that too, I think there are geographic limitations and eligibility requirements that apply with the sage grouse market that aren't necessarily applicable here. And so there are a number of things that I think that we could just improve upon what this current draft to hone the draft to this specific market. So I just wanted to point out that difference, so that's clear.
All right. Mr. Cunton, any further comments or?
Not really. I endorse everything that's been said, Mr. Chairman.
So who from the public, who wishes to testify on this? So just okay. Well, why don't we do this? John, why don't you come up and we'll have you testify, and then we'll take a break. And Dr. Krutka, where's the lunch? Okay, same room as presentations. Okay. Yeah, please introduce yourself and which hat you're wearing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Robitaille, CEO, Encore Green Environmental, Director of the Carbon Asset Network. And today I am representing the Carbon Asset Network, and due to your time constraints, I will try to be rather quick.
I'm interested in your thoughts though, so go ahead.
Yes, sir. As we know, the governor has already set some pretty lofty goals for the state of Wyoming. I think this is a great first step in this approach, as long as it's not inclusive to only underground. As we spoke at your last meeting, we have a tremendous amount of resource available to us for capturing carbon in the surface. I want to thank Mr. Parfit for delivering the report that I have not been able to find for many years. But there is a tremendous amount of information out there that details exactly what we can do in rangeland and crop surface carbon sequestration. I do believe the state needs to be the leader in this type of operation. It's not the first time that the state has led in this type of thing. We've kept the feds at bay a couple of different times come to mind. One would be the hydraulic fracturing rule. We passed that a few administrations ago to keep the feds at bay. And in fact, they copied our rule. Another one was a air quality effort that was started. I believe it was started probably mid 80s, mid 90s, somewhere in that area. And again, the EPA came through and has copied our rule and has put it out for the rest of the world to follow. So Wyoming is not one to be standoffish. Wyoming is one to be a leader in these types of situations. I believe this is a situation that needs to really go forward. As to address Representative Gray's comment, I'm afraid the ball is too far down the field. This is coming whether we want it or not. In my opinion, in endorsing this and involving ourselves in it in a way that will allow Wyoming to be a leader in this aspect will only help our minerals committee or our minerals industry rather than hinder them. This will allow us to continue to develop rather than hinder our development. We've got companies all over the world looking for ways to increase their ESG, to satisfy their shareholders who are calling for carbon neutrality. If we step up and we come out front and we do this right, Wyoming will be the leader in this way. I do want to make a suggestion. I would suggest that DEQ be the agency. I believe they have the ability and the know-how to move this ball forward. As for fees, I would say yes. I would view that as a user tax. If you're going to play in this arena, then pay to play. I think that's a very fair assessment, very, very well done. I will tell you that the major roadblock that we run into when we talk about this with companies or with other organizations is verification. That is the roadblock. If we can have the state stand up and say, yes, this method is approved and we verify it, we see it as scientifically defendable and repeatable, it should go forward. That should be the bar. And I believe that by compiling this bill, and kudos to LSO for writing it as quickly as they did. I think that's wonderful. By completing this bill and using the committee set forth in the bill, I believe that you can come up with a verification process which would allow this ability to go forward and allow our minerals to continue to be produced. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think I will pause and hold off any other comments on the bill as I haven't had a real good chance to review it all. Thank you.
Committee, any questions for Mr. Robitaille? Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Robitaille, this user fee, would it just be the providers paying that, or would it be the people that are buying the tickets also?
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest at least the provider. Those that would be purchasing the ability to store carbon, I think would be already involving an economic incentive, and an additional incentive may push them towards other markets.
Okay. Any
Thank
other
you, Mr.
questions for Mr. Robitaille? Representative Bear, I know this is a huge interest to yours, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is kind of going a little bit of a different direction, but you brought up a lot of comments about science, which I appreciate. In your research and your interest in this subject, have you seen any information about us being potentially in carbon deficits? And do we, by creating this situation, motivate more carbon sequestration and those types of things that increase a carbon deficit situation?
Mr. Chairman, I cannot say that I have run across anything like that. I can tell you there is a report out there, and I'm happy to submit it to the committee if you'd like to see it. There's a report. It was one of the authors is a Dr. Justin Derner, who works for the USDA over in Cheyenne at the ARS Research Center. And in his report, it details just how absolute much potential there is in rangeland, particularly in the West, for this type of activity to take place. Grazing, of course, only helps. When we graze a grass in particular, a grass as it grows up, as you cut the top off, it moves out. You might notice that in your lawns until you get grass where you don't want it. Well, that's because we're cutting the top off and it's moving out. So as we increase the plant population, the diversity of those plants through grazing, we are only increasing our potential for carbon sequestration.
Oops. All right, committee. Mr. Robitaille, thank you. Anyone else from the public wishes to comment? So committee, is this, this was teed up for an interim topic. There's a lot to do on this, but I think we do is as a committee, let's go ahead and, let's think about it. Let's work on it to share some comments between ourselves as we move forward. I actually thought on this particular topic, if this got some legs and was being welcomed by industry, that I may go ahead and ask for an additional day to work on this, maybe sometime in, I don't know, I guess it'd have to be like early January. I don't know, it's just been a strange year of getting our topics lined up. And I didn't know where this would go. I knew we needed to have a good discussion about it. I think it's important for Wyoming to have a good discussion about this. So right now, I don't think we need to take any action on it. But I'd be very much interested in comments from the committee and from it.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So would your concept be that we have a longer discussion, not necessarily your one day, but at the November meeting? Correct. As to formalize this more, put some, real specifics to it? Is that your concept? I'm just curious.
Well, so yeah, Representative Burkhart, what I think is we've got, Kip's Mr. Connington's an expert in this area. Ms. Fitzgerald's been working on this I think they continue to get comfortable with the draft, continue to look at it. I think with the group I'm looking around, who's all in the audience here, there's a lot of industry, a broad spectrum of industry represented as you get their input on this. And I mean, if we're trying to move to carbon capture, okay, which we are, okay, so I've pushed my entire legislative career, this is a critical component of it, is how then do we get additional credit for that carbon capture? And, I mean, the end game here is that what we all want is to keep coal in the game. And this is a component of that. So Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are we thinking about addressing all aspects of the carbon capture at a later meeting, or just the credits in specific?
So I think the answer to your question is that we set up a framework that creates a regulatory environment where you let the experts develop what those rules are. So if they can come in and put together a set of rules that this is truly a credit or a token or an offset at this percentage, and they're able to do that, and they come in and they're able to verify that so that the private industry that's engaged in this can trust that opens that market up. That's all we're doing. I'm not going to talk about whether deep saline sequestration is better or what value it has versus what Mr. Robitaille's business is doing with enhancing rangeland. I'm not. That's not me. We set up a framework for experts to do that. So we can, I think we continue the discussion committee. Okay. So we don't need to take any action. The only action we need to take right now is go get some lunch, stretch our legs. Let's meet back in here. That clock's 5 minutes fast. So let's try to look somewhere around 12:30-ish. And then we've got sort of an update from the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, which we can eat our lunch to or whatever we need to. So, okay. So we'll recess for 15 minutes or so, Mr. Chairman.
Sounds good.